Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Edelgard of the Rebellion in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 31, A Pair of Caged Birds. Even Edelgard's armored visor, coated with multiple layers of anti-reflective material to hide her identity, could not hide the look of surprise underneath. "What?" she demanded. "I guess you could consider them my kids," Happy said wryly. "In a very fucked up way." Happy was currently pouring 2 cups of boiling tea for the two of them, but now with what she revealed she no longer was quite as eager to take a sip. She moved to get up and wring the answers from her throat, but Claude reached his hand over Hilda, who yelped to move out of the way. But instead of trying to hold her back, he instead put his hand on her shoulder plate in what was meant to be a reassuring gesture. It most certainly was not. It only made her more annoyed. "Claude," she hissed, "what are you doing?" "Relax," he said, and his hand returned to where it belonged. "You should hear her out before you smash the place." "Why should I?" she snapped. "Those abominations need to die. I think we can agree on that." "But," Claude sighed, "we should at least hear Happy out for a bit." "Happy's right here, you know," Happy pointed out. Hilda and Ash looked at each other, unsure what to think of the unfolding three-way battle before them. But neither of them made a move, so they just slumped further down on the couch, which was still a bit too small for 4 people. Hilda reached for her cup of tea and elbowed Ash in the process, which caused Ash to elbow her back just enough not to spill her tea. She blew a raspberry and took a sip with a satisfied grin on her face. "Fine," Edelgard huffed, her anger abating slightly. "Start talking. Now. What exactly do you mean by this place being your prison? What's there to talk about?" Happy shrugged. "I'm stuck here. I can't leave. There aren't any soldiers here." "And you made those monsters," Edelgard accused. "Can't you tell them to stand down?" "Oh, no. They won't hurt me." "But," the woman said, with a hint of sadness, "if I leave, my jailer would be pretty sad." "Jailer?" Ash asked. "There isn't any jail under Mount Gaspard. I meant the one who keeps me here. Jailer in a metaphorical sense. The reason why I'm here in the first place." "Oh, poor Coco," Happy wistfully said, and her eyes went distant for a moment. She's not all there, Edelgard thought. Perhaps being cooped up underneath a mountain was bad for the mind, or that was why she was here in the first place. But no matter how loopy Happy was, if that was even her real name, nobody deserved to be kept here as a prisoner of HTE magistrate. Though it did complicate matters that she was still technically complicit in the human experimentation Edelgard hated so much, so for now Edelgard was unsure of what to think of the woman before her. "You were telling me about Coco before," Claude prodded. "Mind continuing?" "Coco?" A strange nickname, but she knew that she had heard it before. For some reason, she associated it with a haughty laugh that Edelgard couldn't quite place. She would have to sit on it and hope that it came to her soon. "Oh. Sure. Where was I?" "Something about you and Coco living in Abyss." Happy took a sip of her tea. "Not sugary enough." "So?" Hilda asked impatiently. "Well, I'd rather not talk about life before then," Happy shrugged. "All you need to know is that I met Coco there, along with Bee and Yuri Bird. We had a mentor of sorts down there. None of us attended formal high school anyway. We called ourselves the Ashen Wolves." "Oh, catchy," Claude grinned. "Deer, wolves, and eagles. There's a whole zoo in the room." Edelgard remained stony-faced. But underneath, she was beginning to show understanding as her brow furrowed in thought. Yuri Bird. Yuri Bird. Yuri. There was only one Yuri that mattered. The de facto lord of the underground himself, the savage mockingbird, and the one and only owner of Leclerc's. Happy had probably gone mad as any prisoner of the magistrate could be. But if there was even an iota of the truth in her words, then she would have to ask the bartender himself to get the full picture. And B had to be Balthus. It lined up too perfectly to be anything else. It was a shame she had nearly burned her bridges with Leclerc's after her little outburst in his office, but it was not completely burned. Plus, it doubled as a way to figure out Leclerc's mysterious past. She noticed out of the corner of her eye that Ash was nervously fidgeting with his crossbow, though it was unloaded, so she wasn't particularly worried. Perhaps he knew something about Yuri that Edelgard didn't as well, which posed far too many questions about the savage mockingbird and why he knew the son of Governor Lonato. I wanted something cooler, but Yuri Bird insisted. We were happy, I guess. For a time. There was nothing the Ashen Wolves couldn't do together. Her expression turned sad. But then Coco and I left for Fhurdiad on a whim, leaving the other two behind. And one day, Coco was gone too. Vanished without a trace. So you looked for her, Edelgard guessed. And dug too deep for your own good. It was a classic tale, one that resulted in far too many unidentified bodies and accidents. Yep. Didn't take very long before the magistrate clapped me in irons and forced me to work for them, only to find her in their custody as well. But why? Hilda asked. They wouldn't just kidnap her for no reason, right? Then she realized what she was saying. Oh, who am I kidding? They definitely would. Coco thought that the magistrate could fix her, Happy recalled. That's why she went to them in the first place. But their idea of fixing her was strange. What was wrong with her in the first place? Claude asked. She ignored his question. When I saw her next, it was as if she was a completely different person. But not all the time there were hints of the old Coco peeking through, whenever they moved her to a new location. And like a fool, I agreed to work for them if it meant I had a chance to save her. Edelgard wanted so badly to tell her to get the hell on with it, and to wring her neck just as she had set out to do from the beginning. Really, the only thing mattered was how to kill those creatures out there. She had made them, so there was a fair assumption that she knew how to unmake them. But part of her felt pity for Happy. Here she was, rambling about her life story to people she had just met. Maybe she had been deprived of human interaction for far too long that she was beginning to remember what it was like to have a two-sided conversation. Memories threatened to surface glimpses of her real past. They were reminders that Edelgard had once gone through the same thing, imprisoned in an unfamiliar place, with barely any human interaction aside from the few moments with her brother that she had each day. Everything will be okay, Dimitri. I promise. Nobody will hurt you as long as I'm here. But remembering hurt, so she stuffed those memories as deep as she could and continued to listen to Happy's story. And that's why you made these monsters? Ash asked. Happy nodded, her red hair becoming even more frazzled as she nervously tapped a rhythm on the table. Yep. A funny thing, mutations are. What happens when you introduce a drop of black chimeral blood to a petri dish of stem cells? Nothing. But introduce a drop of heaven first, and something interesting happens. Ahem. Edelgard cleared her throat. Less about the how, and more about the why. So rude, Happy tooted. No appreciation for the sciences. What are they teaching you kids these days? I can appreciate it when we get out of here, she retorted. We is contingent on your cooperation. I already told you, I can't leave, sighed Happy. Anyway, yes, I am making monsters for the magistrate. All in the name of their grand design and, to pave a road for a brighter future. I can't believe anyone believes in that crap. I don't, said Hilda. Claude rolled his eyes at the sheer audacity of his second-in-command. Yeah, whatever, she said dismissively. Then Happy's tone went back to being deadly serious as her expression narrowed. They're trying to perfect something, though they haven't told me what yet, she explained. All these gene experiments, introducing unstable elements into the human genomes, making monsters, they all lead to something. Part of why I continue is so that I can figure out what they're doing. But doing so means you're playing right into their hands, Edelgard figured. You're giving them the tools to do whatever it is they're trying to do. Happy snorted. I've given them monsters, not anything of value. Just because they ignore me and have a disturbing amount of resilience doesn't mean they're actually useful to the scary men in suits. It's what happens to people when I try the gene modification process on them without the proper genetic markers. The proper genetic markers? Claude asked. What, like some kind of mutant gene? No. If it were that simple, then the magistrate would already be running around with an army of super soldiers, rather than the minor enhancements some soldiers receive. There are certain noble families that have specific genetic markers that make them more receptive to experimentation. But if you induce those same genetic changes on someone not part of those bloodlines, then you end up with monsters. Why is that, I wonder? Certain families, Edelgard said quietly, knowing full well what the ramifications of that statement were. The tragedy of Dusker was meticulously planned. Was this why? Oh, I don't know the details. Just because I'm a geneticist doesn't mean that I'm a fucking genealogy expert, Happy scoffed. My job is to specifically ignore those genes and operate on the average grunt. You want answers? Go ask the guy in charge. And who's that? Hilda asked. I want to have a word with your boss about whatever shit is going on down here. She lightly tapped her axe lying on the floor, as if to say that she would make good on her threat. Thales, Edelgard declared after a bit of thinking. The hand of the Empire. Yes, technically, but I send direct reports to Cornelia instead, she said. Oops. I shouldn't have said that. They'll probably kill me for saying that. I'm not even convinced Cornelia is a real person, Claude frowned, crossing his arms. On paper she's head of their research division, but there isn't a shred of information about her life or even her accolades. Did you find that out when you tried to poison her? Hilda joked. Then she put her hand over her mouth. Oops. I shouldn't have told them that, either. Can't really poison a woman unless she exists, can I? Bantered Claude playfully. Hilds, you're on weapons cleaning duty for the next week. Hilda pouted. How long have you been here, Happy? Ash asked. How long has it been since you've? Since I've seen the sun. I lived in Abyss, you know, she flippantly replied. I don't have too much love for the surface. But, oh, I don't know, I graduated 5 years ago, so 4 years ago I started working for them. Maybe it was 3, though. Don't really keep track anymore. Were you here this whole time, then? Right under our noses. Our noses, she asked. Under Mount Gaspard. Under Lonato's eye, he said, trailing off. Oh, no, I only moved here last year, she said nonchalantly, as if she were discussing a move to the suburbs. They would shuffle me from lab to lab, working on all sorts of things. There's a lot of labs dotted around Newfoundland like this in the weirdest of places, with a bunch of magistrate soldiers guarding them. Then where are yours? Claude asked. Soldiers, I mean. Oh, they got too close to the animals. I don't really care, since it just means more rations for me and Coco in the long run. And to be honest, she snidely added, I sort of preferred the animals anyway. Edelgard had the sinking feeling that she wasn't telling the whole truth. From what she had seen, the upper sections had been abandoned completely for months, if not years. And the monsters had to be eating something, though there was also the possibility that Happy was feeding them. But for some reason she didn't seem like the nurturing type, so it was more likely that most of them were dead and their corpses sustained the monsters above. It also seemed strange that the magistrate didn't simply replenish the garrison stationed here, but then again it made no sense to build a lab underneath the territory of a hostile former governor. But considering she had only found one prior to meeting Happy, then it meant that they were doing something right. She would have to redouble her efforts in tracking their supply lines and destroying any progress they made. Perhaps it would take her one step closer in deciphering the mystery of Project Sethline. Would you happen to know where those are, then? Claude said. If you're gonna torture me for that, then whatever, Happy shrugged. Go ahead. Just know that I have no idea where the other labs are, aside from the general area. The hand knows not what the other hand holds. In the past, the Queen of Flames had interrogated quite a few smugglers and mercenaries who had sold their souls to work for the magistrate. One of two things happened: either they broke after a certain number of fingernails, or appendages, were removed, or they went to the grave keeping their secrets. She preferred the former much more than the latter, which was why she rarely interrogated enforcers or anyone with an unhealthy loyalty to the God Emperor. And it was a crude way to extract information, but it did produce results. In a sense, their little conversation with Happy was an interrogation in of itself. But it was certainly the strangest one that Edelgard had ever been present for. Rather than forcing Happy to suffer, she instead indulged her quirks and let her ramble on. The woman was infuriatingly vague, but every nugget of information she divulged was valuable to the point where she was seriously considering bringing her along. Happy didn't seem too eager to stay, it was more as if she had resigned herself to doing so. She dimly wondered if Dmitri had still been alive, then would she have stayed all those years ago? "Nah, we won't do that," said Hilda. "Well, at least us three won't. I can't say the same for Miss Queen of Flames over there." "Were you in Remire?" Edelgard asked, changing the topic. Happy paused, taken aback. "How do you know?" "Ran into a laboratory there," she said with steely calm that barely hid the anger underneath. "Experimenting on kids. Big monster tried to eat my men." "Know anything about that?" "Oh, that's what happened," she said. "I figured nothing good would be there after I left." "You left?" she asked. That was not the answer she was expecting. "I don't experiment on kids," Happy said. "Too squirmy for my work. Can't say the same about some of my shoddier colleagues." So the rumors were true, Claude mused. The Magistrate Research Division is not only up to their knees in human experimentation, but they've also been experimenting on kids. He shook his head. "No wonder you're so up in arms about the whole system," he said, looking at Edelgard. "You were there, weren't you?" Her silence said more than any words could. They didn't take no for an answer. Happy shuddered. "But the captain of the guard team vouched for me there, so they only forced me to go without rations for a week and then I got shipped off anyway. I wonder how Morris is doing." "That's horrible," whispered Ash. "I'm sorry." "Well, I appreciate it, but I'm over it." "And you aren't the magistrate." "Right," she said, pointing an inquisitive gaze at the group lounging on the sofa before her. "This isn't some sort of insider threat initiative." "Have you watched the news lately?" Hilda pointed out. "I'm sitting between Most Wanted number 1 and Most Wanted number 3 here. They fucking hate the magistrate." "Hilda, I doubt the poor lady gets any news down here," Claude chided. "Oh, I do," Happy said. "There's a landline with Netflix. But why would I watch the news when I can watch the next season of Fodlan's Got Talent?" And there she went again. "Okay, that's nice and all," Claude said, "but how do we get out of here?" "The door? It's right next to you." He smacked his forehead lightly. "Don't play dumb. Thank you for the tea, but I'd rather get back to the Golden Deer before Lysathea uses me as a test dummy again." "You'd have to take the cargo elevator to get out, which is that way," Happy said, gesturing to her left. "But good luck getting past Coco." "She isn't a monster, is she?" whispered Ash. "Monster is relative." Happy's eyes flared. "If you mean a beast with all the little pointy things sticking out, then not really. She's just as pretty as the day I met her. But she will use your bodies for her experiments and then kill you. I, at least, am nice enough to wait till after you die." "Wow, thanks," muttered Hilda. "If you want to see what happens when the right augmentations have been applied on the right person, well, here's your chance." "I, for one, am looking forward to not seeing that." "The right augmentations?" Edelgard asked. She had been asking an awful amount of questions to someone who gave only half answers shrouded in mystery, but it was better than no answers at all. Material tensors take quite a lot of mental strain to use from all the eyeballing and mental calculations. Coco was always smart, but whatever they did fucked her brain up beyond even my understanding, Happy revealed. So fucked up, that she could use them with little to no effort all. I just wish that they left a little more of the Coco I knew. Tensors. One of Coco's little experiments. Happy chuckled to herself darkly. Matter manipulation through attractor theory. You'll see. You'll all see. Edelgard and Claude shared a look, though it was mostly for show considering she was still wearing a helmet. It was the mutual feeling of, "Are you seeing this shit?" that they shared with one another, which they had done more than a few times in university. "Well," Claude said, placing his cup of tea on the table, "thank you for having us." "And for the tea. It's quite nice." "Oh, did the cyanide not kick in?" Happy asked dryly. "A shame." Hilda gasped in shock and nearly threw her cup onto the floor, but Claude just chuckled. "You are pretty funny. Even if you're insane," he added. Edelgard looked at the small strip of paper poking out of the surface of Claude's drink, which was probably how he tested for poison. It gave her a little comfort that the strip was only stained brown and not a bright color, though then again with her enhanced metabolism most poisons failed to have an effect on her. Poor Hilda, however, would probably die a rather painful death. She realized that she would have to make a choice whether to kill her, or to take her along with them. Happy was as dangerous as any swordsman or mercenary despite the fact that she probably couldn't even swing a sword. Her handiwork had already been quite successful, and though Edelgard wasn't looking for someone to make monsters, whatever she knew could turn the tide against the magistrate. And perhaps there was a personal touch to it. She knew a fellow victim of Thales's machinations when she saw one. Whatever crimes she had committed paled in comparison to what Edelgard had done, and perhaps she could offer a road to redemption for the eccentric woman. Happy. Come with us, Edelgard offered. You don't have to work for the magistrate anymore. Why? She asked. What if I said I liked it here? That's a load of bullshit and you know it, said Hilda, still miffed about the poisoning that may or may not have occurred. Who would willingly stay as a prisoner? You would, if you had someone you were desperately trying to save, Happy replied bitterly. Maybe we can save her too, Ash suggested. The boy was naive to a fault, but he had a point. If she was able to bring whoever Coco was along, then it would force Happy to come as well. And of course, it would ensure her allegiance to Edelgard and Edelgard only, unless she wanted an unfortunate accident to befall her friend. Coco's too far gone, Happy whispered. But I can maybe buy you some time. My dear Happy, a shrill voice cried out. Are those visitors I hear? They're just heading out, Happy called out in return. Nonsense. I will see for myself. Go, she whispered angrily. The couch exploded with motion as all four of them scrambled to their feet, grabbing their weapons and heading for the door. If you want to live, then leave now. Forget about me, and she might forget about you. Hey, whispered Claude. Are we supposed to be scared of this, Coco? Edelgard knew to not tempt fate and say no. Instead, she whipped out her holox, but kept it unextended for the moment. She exited first out of the small lounge, searching for the exit. After a tense moment she found it, all the way in the back. Behind quite a few tables and ceiling-high racks of equipment, a exit sign shone brightly in neon red. She could probably run there in several seconds, but she also would be leaving her companions in the dust. Oh ho ho ho! Who dares trespass in the lab of the great Constance von Novelli? It was the voice again, a woman's one with a haughty attitude and a high pitch. As Hilda, Ash, and Claude shuffled out of the lounge, she watched as one of the side doors opened to reveal a beautiful blonde woman glaring at them. Her blue eyes that matched with her headband and her earrings shone underneath the laboratory lights, but it was her clothing that drew her attention. She wore a flowing black dress with a dusty rose strip in the middle that left most of her upper chest exposed. Most notably, embedded in the center of her suit was a pulsing power source of some kind that lit up at unsteady intervals. Lines ran up and down her body into her white gloves, which stretched from her fingertips to her elbow. But the gloves themselves were odd. They crackled with energy, and Edelgard could see the way they seemed to shimmer like a vibroblade. She noticed that the book she had in her hand was not actually touching her hand, it was hovering about 2 inches from her palm. Claude whistled at the sight of her, which prompted a quick elbow from Hilda. We're just trying to leave, blurted out Ash. Ha! A likely story. No, I think you are rats, trying to take my dear Happy away from me. What? No, we're not, Dash. I shall not apologize for this. But you all must die, Constance declared. Constance von Novelli. 55%. Successful implantation of cell matrix. In progress. The list from the lab at Remeyer. That was where she had seen her name before. She cursed herself for not connecting the dots earlier. She realized, with horror, that she had met Constance before. She remembered her as a young girl with the same blonde hair and strange fashion sense, sitting at the kids' table in the in-bear socialite parties that her biological father made her attend. She even had the same haughty holier-than-thou attitude that she had now, even if it was far worse at the moment. That was nearly 2 decades ago, and while she remembered little of the girl, she did recall her aptitude for boldly explaining scientific theory. Duck, shouted Claude, and Edelgard froze. She was so caught up in her thoughts that she barely missed the table being thrown at her with the speed and force of a small vehicle. It tumbled through the air, and Edelgard managed to block it with her hollow shield in time, deflecting it away from her as it fell to the ground. "Behold! The superiority of House Novelli!" Constance shouted. Edelgard watched numbly as she held her left hand outward in a claw shape, and a dim beam of energy appeared that latched onto another table. With a flourish of her hand she lifted it, and with her other hand, she lifted another table only to throw both at the same time. "Oh shit!" Hilda cried out. She raised her axe and cut both of the tables in two in one smooth motion, leaving the pieces on the ground. "You're making me worry." Constance was now throwing half of the laboratory at them. She ripped several tiles out of the floor and hurled it horizontally at them, threatening to take off their heads if she wasn't careful. The first one she managed to block quite easily with her shield, and Edelgard began to advance at a steady pace. Hilda was swatting at the projectiles for Ash and Claude, who now were ready to fire a salvo at Constance with their weapons raised. "Give it up, lady!" Claude shouted. "We don't want to hurt you." "As if someone so beneath me could do any real damage," Constance sniffed with disdain. She didn't seem at all fazed by the arrow knocked in Claude's bow, or the bolt, courtesy of Claude, locked in Ash's crossbow. "Coco, stop!" Happy yelled, running over and grabbing one of her arms. "They just want to leave. They've come to take you and my research," she snarled. "All trespassers must die." "No, don't dash." Edelgard's eyes widened as an invisible force sent Happy flying sideways, though she somehow landed in a chair with a small thump. It was as if Constance was perfectly calculating exactly how much force she used to do so, throwing her projectiles with malignant force and handing Happy gently. She slumped into the chair sadly, and she could have sworn there was a tear running down Happy's cheek. Those gloves she wore, they were the key. Her hand gestures telegraphed her attacks. She would have to motion with her hands to pick an object up. If it really was using an attractor field, then the beams would also serve as a way to keep track of what she was holding onto at the moment. All Edelgard had to do was find an opening. "Oh, Linhard would love this." "Sorry, my dear," Constance said. "I have to protect our work at any cost." Claude and Ash loosed their bows at Constance, with Ash unleashing a tight burst of 3 bolts. But she merely held her right hand up and they froze in the air, suspended in time, as if they had never been fired at all. Constance looked at them, amused. With a flick of her wrist, they uselessly clattered to the ground. "That's not normal," muttered Claude. Ash just lowered his right wrist, his jaw agape at what he had just seen. On the other hand, Edelgard wasted no time. As Constance lowered her hand to pull a table upwards to throw at them, she dashed forward and swung at the woman with her axe. As much as she wanted to save Happy's dear Coco, she couldn't risk the danger of trying to bring her back alive. But her blow was a little slower than she anticipated. Something stayed her hand. Was it mercy? Pity? She did not have time to ponder the question as Constance made a grasping motion with her left hand. Edelgard froze mid-swing, her suit groaning as it yearned to break free from whatever she was doing. Her body was not frozen as she struggled desperately to move, but her armor was. It stood there, an empty shell, locking her in place. Constance grunted with effort, a bead of sweat running down her forehead as a vein pulsed. She now shone a brilliant white from the lines that crisscrossed her dress, as if her power source was struggling to keep her in place. Edelgard yelled in anger as she tried so desperately to bring her hollowks forward. It was inches away from her, but it was as if she was locked inside her own armor. The metal plates groaned as they nearly broke at the joints, but she found that little by little she could move her arm. All she needed was time. Claude took the opportunity to aim a couple arrows toward her head. Constance harmlessly swatted away both of them, but this forced her to relinquish her grasp on Edelgard. And with that, she pushed her hand outward, throwing Edelgard several dozen feet backwards onto the ground. She nearly flattened Hilda as she crashed to the ground with enough force to shatter the tiles in a large radius. A surge of pain ran through her torso as her suit met the ground, and she cried out reflexively. She strained with effort to get up, as more and more tiles swirled in the air. It was like a tornado, and Claude and Ash were trying to shoot them as they rained down upon them. "Grab my hand," yelled Hilda. The pink-haired girl reached out her hand for Edelgard, and she grabbed it with the urgency of a dying woman. She yanked Edelgard out of the way of a table that embedded into the floor where she had been moments earlier, and with some effort she was back on her own 2 feet. Her entire body ached. Had she been a normal human being, she would have been dead many times over. "Run!" shouted Happy from her chair. She wasn't held down anymore by Constance, but she made no effort to move. Forget about us. There were no protests from any of them. As much as she wanted to sever that smug face from her neck, Edelgard was powerless until she developed a countermeasure. It was as if Constance knew what she needed to stop and what she needed to throw, balancing offense and defense with relative ease. Whatever augmentations she had gave her the ability to do so, nobody other than an AI could do those kinds of calculations on the fly. And Edelgard's suit of armor seemed to be working against her. She noticed that Constance could not throw her in her bodysuit, but instead seemed to be manipulating the pieces of armor that covered her. She was a sitting duck against her might, which was a prospect that greatly unsettled her. Today was certainly not her day. And for what seemed like the umpteenth time in the last 24 hours, Edelgard decided to make a tactical retreat and run for the hills. Claude and Ash bolted for the exit, but the former glanced behind him to make sure Hilda and the Queen of Flames were coming along with them. Edelgard covered Hilda as they retreated, walking backwards with her hollow shield facing Constance so that it covered most of their bodies. The tiles were hitting with enough force to leave glowing red cracks in the projected energy field, and she absent-mindedly wondered just how fast they had been moving to do so much damage. All right, we're leaving," yelled Hilda. "Now can you stop throwing shit at us?" "How uncouth," Constance gasped. "And no, I shall not. I will ask again, would you please die?" She ripped up a ball of concrete out of the ground, and with that Edelgard whirled around and practically shoved Hilda toward the exit. She tumbled into Claude's expectant arms as Edelgard tried her best to defend them with her hollow shield. Constance cackled as she threw the concrete straight for Edelgard, which she barely managed to cleave in half with her axe before another table came flying at her. "The lift's here," shouted Ash. "Go." Edelgard swatted away another tile, before blocking what seemed to be a rain of needles coming from Constance. She looked downright demonic as she rained down death from above, grand flowy gestures accompanying every object that was thrown at them. But she was beginning to tire based on the fact that her attacks were slowing in frequency, though they were probably increasing in intensity. Hilda and Claude ran into the lift, with Edelgard slowly backing up into it. As soon as she crossed the threshold where the door was, she quickly grabbed the handle to shut the door and practically slammed it closed. The lift was old and rickety, pretty much everything was rusty, and she prayed that it actually still worked. Steel cables ran along the sides through the exposed cave walls, connecting to the platform that seemed to wobble as she walked. There wasn't even a button, just an old-fashioned handle that Claude slammed downwards to activate the pulley system. "Phew," Hilda said. "I thought we were gunners." Then the door came off of its hinges, and the screaming started. Edelgard raised her hollow shield instinctively, but it wasn't fast enough to block the first jagged piece of metal that shot toward her. It hurtled directly toward her eye socket, making her flinch and close her eyes. Claude yanked her backwards as it hit her visor with a loud thunk. She opened her eyes to find that about an inch from her right eye was a shard of metal, embedded into her visor halfway through. Her vision was stymied by a cascading series of cracks that ran through the eyeline and the HUD. Despite this, the elevator began to lurch downward. It stopped for a brief moment, and Edelgard's heart did as well for a moment before proceeding on its path toward whatever unspeakable horrors lurked below. She heard a cry of anguish and rage echoing through the elevator shaft, bouncing off the rock walls as they plummeted down. "Oh my goddess," Hilda spluttered. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she groaned, "but I'm going to need a new helmet." "That's okay, because I'll probably need a new set of pants after." What the hell was that?" Ash murmured. "Telekinesis, almost like it was magic." She did not have the heart to tell him that there was no such thing as magic, only sufficiently advanced enough science to render everything else obsolete. The tensors, as Happy had called them, certainly were possible by the laws of science. Gravity manipulation with attractor theory was certainly a hypothetical prospect, but seeing it in action was another thing. Constance von Novelli was as terrifying as she looked, and they had been lucky to escape with their lives. A few more hits and her hollow shield would have broken, or if she had simply folded Edelgard's armor in on itself, then she would have been dead. Relax. Ash, was it? Claude asked. With any luck, we won't have to see her again. Now, Queen of Flames. Let me see your helmet. She reluctantly obliged, revealing the shard of metal that was embedded in her visor. She could probably pull it out herself, but there was a risk that it would shatter and leave a bunch of glass shards embedded in her face. Claude was definitely more dexterous than her, judging from her prior experience with him. But there was the risk that it would reveal far too much about her true identity than she had planned for, though part of her longed to reveal the truth to someone else. Hold still, Claude said, as he carefully grabbed the shard of metal with his white gloves and yanked it out. Part of the visor splintered as he did so he carefully picked away at the glass near her eye so that it wouldn't hurt her. And for the first time in a long time, she saw the true Claude without the filter of red that she viewed the world in. When he was done, it left a ping-pong ball-sized hole where the metal shard had been, revealing a weary lavender eye underneath. Lavender eyes, he murmured under his breath, loud enough only for her to hear. And what about it? Edelgard replied angrily. Nothing. They're just mesmerizing, Claude trailed off. Those were the same words he had said long ago, one fateful night after the city championships, where the captain of the archery team had stolen her heart only for her to steal it back the morning after. She had given her heart and her body to Claude, a mistake that would follow her for as long as the leader of the Golden Deer remained alive. Perhaps those words were intentional, a way to taunt her, that he did know who the Queen of Flames really was. But for now, she held her tongue and did not say anything at all. Though she trusted Claude about as far as she could throw him, she knew that they both had their secrets and would do anything to keep them guarded. It was why they never made an effort to really talk after that one night, and it was why Edelgard was so antagonistic towards him every time they met as mercenaries. She had her suspicions about him and whether or not he was really a Regan, but for now, until he played his hand, she would just have to hold hers as well. Hey, Claude. Hilda asked. What's up? He replied nonchalantly. Do you think they're all okay? Her voice wasn't as self-assured as it usually was. There was a nervous quiver to it, as if she feared what Claude might say. Yeah. Claude didn't hesitate. They have to be. She did not know what his escape routes were, nor did he know where the rest of the Golden Deer were. She had seen his Lieutenant Raphael with them, and Lysithea had been in the control room alongside Lonato, but that was about it. Still, the odds were quite high that they were fine, considering Claude von Regan was a master of tactical retreats. The platform stopped with a loud thud, and Hilda wrenched open the door to reveal another tunnel. However, unlike the creepy abandoned laboratory above, this was just another tunnel of abyss. Never before had she been so thankful to see the darkness that lurked beneath Fodlan, and so she motioned for Claude and Ash to head out before her as she covered their rear in case Constance somehow found her way down. Oh great, Hilda groaned. More creepy tunnels. It's fine, Edelgard said. This is the abyss. I can navigate from here. The four of them walked in the strangest formation she had ever seen: 2 deer, 1 loyal soldier, and a queen, all walking in the darkness as she checked her map repeatedly. There still was no signal, and she wondered if the hammer had any effect on her communications. Raphael and Lysithea's teams used Lonato's escape route, Claude recalled. But I didn't see them on the way down. And you guys didn't either, so they must not have entered the mines at all. Where would they be, then? Hilda inquired. With any lucky, they'll be halfway to Deirdre by now. I told them not to stick around and wait for us. It was your fault you wanted to investigate the creepy lift, she accused. We should have led those two to the escape route. Hey, it wasn't my fault they followed me. She should have followed Raphael instead, Claude replied snidely. So we could have avoided the lab in the first place, Ash muttered. Yes, but then we would probably be mush, he admitted. Suffice it to say, this was probably the best outcome. And now you know what was lurking underneath your father's mountain. But he didn't have anything to do with it, he protested. He didn't, Claude said darkly, but that doesn't mean it wasn't happening under his watch. There's a comms station half a mile ahead, Edelgard interjected. I'm going to radio for an escort back to my base. And as much as I would rather you not come along, she said, glaring at Claude, I suppose I can't just leave you to die here. Sure, he said dismissively. We'll head to Deirdre from the surface afterwards. And Ash? She asked, her tone softening. What about you? He paused. I don't know. Are there any of Lonato's men left? I hope so, she replied. I know the ones that Lonato ordered to leave left with the deer. Then. I'll stay with you for now, he sheepishly said. Until I find Lonato's body. She did knock you out, Hilda recalled. Sure you don't want to come with us then? I want to know why he wanted me to live so badly, he admitted. I've been fighting for the sake of my father's vengeance, so that I could avenge Kristoff. And with that gone, I'm just, not sure. About anything. And perhaps following the Queen of Flames is the path to do so for now. Then it shall be so, Edelgard declared. You can stay in our base for the time being. Awfully nice, aren't you? Claude joked. I'm surprised you are not charging him room and board. I know I would. I made a promise to Lonato, Edelgard said curtly. I intend to keep it. Avenge us, Lambert said. Those who killed us, tear them apart. Lonato was not too different from her own father after all. Maybe that was why she felt so sympathetic to Ash, orphaned only to be adopted and orphaned again. Well, that was nice, Claude said, referring to the eventful ordeal they had just gone through together. But I'd like a bottle of Almiran rum and a long night of sleep. Oh, me too, Hilda groaned. Throw in a pink Deirdre and I'll be happy. Why do you even like that? He snapped. It tastes like you threw sugar in vodka. And that's a bad thing. I guess some people just don't have taste, he wistfully said. Ash. I don't know what those are, he said sheepishly. Claude. Hilda whined. He's like 12. Don't encourage underage drinking. I am not 12, he replied back. I turned 19 3 weeks ago. Well, happy belated birthday, Claude said dryly. And, if I recall correctly, you were drunk many times before your 21st birthday, so can you really talk, Hilds? I was the drunk one, she replied, scandalized. Me. I remember you used to spill drinks everywhere the moment your face got a tiny bit red. I remember when Lawrence was on your case about being drunk at a party, and you told the deputy governor of Deirdre to piss the fuck off. And I seem to recall that time you slept with my training partner when we got shit-faced boy. I was pissed when she came to practice with a hangover dash. Okay, please stop, Claude said, his face turning red. Fair point. Can we drop the topic already? No, not until you apologize for sleeping with Dash. Please don't, he said, his face buried in his palms. Don't go to Newfoundland University, Edelgard muttered to Ash. They're all idiots. He chuckled at that, though it did little to lift his spirits considering he had just lost a father. And what he had seen back in the laboratory had certainly deflated his sails. The monsters, the crazy lady making them, and the other crazy lady throwing half of the laboratory back at them. Her mind drifted back to Happy, who had desperately yelled for them to leave in the heat of battle. She was a prisoner, not of the magistrate, but of her own heart. She would do anything to save Constance, even if it meant breaking every ethical code she had learned and working for a shadowy government organization that would probably dispose of her once she outlived her usefulness. And then there was the young Novelli, who commanded gravity itself as if it were a tool and not a fundamental force of nature. She was supposed to be a scion of a noble house, not reduced to some madwoman lurking in a laboratory, so desperate to protect her work that she would kill any trespassers on sight. Yet another victim of the magistrate's experiments consigned to madness, and Edelgard wondered if one day, she, too, would become mad. But despite it all, she had gotten the answers she wanted. Not all of them. Happy was still a tough nut to crack despite her cooperation, and Constance was not exactly in the mood to answer any questions. But they were a step closer to finding out the truth behind the death of her family, and why she, out of all of them, was the one who lived. Why did Edelgard deserve to survive, when so many others stronger and smarter than her died? She would find the truth. No matter how many people she had to kill her way through, no matter what evils she had to commit, how many lies she had to tell, Edelgard von Hresvelg would have her vengeance. And one day, she would return to the lab underneath Mount Gaspard, to seek the knowledge that she so desperately craved. "I will come for you both," she declared. "In the name of the goddess Suthes, I swear that I will." Somewhere, deep down in her subconscious, she heard a girlish giggle filled with delightful irony. Chapter 32, Sweet Dreams. "We're back," Edelgard said calmly as the blast door closed behind them. It was a bit too quiet in the Black Eagles' base. She hoped that they had merely retired to their rooms or were being treated for injuries. She did not want to think about what would happen if they didn't escape into the abyss in time. The command center, set up along what was once an old subway track, still hummed with outputs on the multiple screens. Bernadetta was dozing off with her head plunged into a small purple plushie on one of the terminals, but Hans and Melis were still monitoring the outputs. There were a few Black Eagles and Blade Breakers scattered among the floor, either sitting in chairs or standing as they talked with one another. She noted that Geralt was among them, with Leonie visibly missing. There was Petra and Amine, Cantor, Kent, and the Boros couple convening. She could pick out a few more, but she suddenly found herself being stared at by more than a dozen people. "Holy shit! She's alive," someone shouted. "No shit, dumbass. Do you really think our leader would die like that?" She ignored them and proceeded to greet Geralt as he stood to face her. "Welcome back," Geralt greeted dryly. "Nice base, by the way." "I'm glad it's been to your liking," she replied. "How are your men holding up?" "Fine, mostly. I'll brief you on the details." "It has been quite a while," Petra interjected. "Are you being okay?" She gestured to the hole that she had in her helmet, which was not ignored by the rest of the room. "I'm fine. Thank you, everyone, for your hard work. I will address the rest of you once I'm ready, and debrief. For now, get some sleep. Please," she added. Not a single person stirred. She sighed. "You guys, stay with me. Geralt, Petra, stay. The rest of you, please go. I'm going to need the room for a bit." She gestured to Hilda, Ash, Claude, and the new addition of Didier who had commandeered one of their trucks to bring them back to the base. They nodded in affirmation, and soon her soldiers began to stir. Melis lightly tapped Bernadetta to wake her, before shaking her to no apparent effect. Amine instead took the lead by picking her up and bringing her into one of the spare rooms, which their base had no shortage of. The rest of the men and women shuffled out slowly, though she heard a few murmurings among them. She would have to deal with the subject of their apparent defeat later once they woke. Once the room was cleared of everyone, Edelgard activated the silencers on the command center and gestured for everyone to take a seat. She stood next to the consoles as she waited for them to take their positions. Ahem. She cleared her throat, feeling their expecting gazes on her. "With this, we begin the debriefing meeting." And then the Queen of Flames sighed, which came out more like a low synthesized tone from her voice box. "Do not bullshit me. How bad is it?" "If I may?" Geralt asked. She nodded. "It could be worse," Geralt admitted. "Claire and the Menton kid went off ahead and got themselves killed." He sighed, the weary kind when a man resigned himself to telling their family that their son or daughter would never return home. "5 of my men have been crippled, but they'll live. I suppose you'll foot the bill for the cybernetics." "It's the least I can do," she relented. "And Leonie? Out cold. Mercedes is in the infirmary taking care of the injured soldiers." At the mention of her friend, the tension drained from her shoulders. They were in good hands, unlike a hospital or the other medics that were in their employ. She was, by all accounts, a miracle worker. But there were some injuries that even Mercedes could not heal, and so she wondered how many would die under her watch before the woman's smile wavered. "Thank you, Geralt. Petra? I know Didier has filled me in to the best of his ability, but I'd like to hear what you have to say. The casualties are being, what is the word, better than is being expected. We have lost Kent, Noah, and Nissa. There are a dozen men in the infirmary, though they are expecting to be making a full recovery." Edelgard sucked in her breath. She had only been told of 2 deaths, a third must have died while Didier had gone to pick them up from beneath Lonatos Mountain. Still, it was far better than she had hoped in the first place, though she knew that her soldiers were not disposable. It bothered her that she barely had time to know them, share drinks with them, or even learn their backstories, but Edelgard would have to make up for it by supporting what they had left in terms of family. "And how are the Black Eagles?" she asked. "They are in minor upbeat spirits," Petra replied. "Tired. Perhaps they are being disappointed that we did not win, but they are proud of defeating a legion. But there will be needing an explanation of the weapon that the Empire is using." "That goes for my men as well," Geralt added. "They aren't as upbeat, but we made the Empire fight for every inch of that mountain, and I'm damn proud of us. I wish I hadn't lost anyone, but they knew the risk when they signed on for the mission. And you saved quite a few men by pulling us out before the whole mountain got obliterated." "What's the damage to the mountain?" "Utter and total," Dida declared. "We now have a complete image of the damage. If the Golden Deer's gambit destroyed everything below 1,000 feet, then the blast that shook Newfoundland destroyed everything above it. The top of a mountain is a smoking crater, along with everyone there. We were lucky that we managed to evacuate in time. If we had not..." She shuddered to think of having to restart over from scratch. Still, there were more pressing matters at hand, namely the super weapon that had turned a mountain into rubble. "Claude," she said, turning to look at the leader of the Golden Deer. "Would you like to share what you know about the hammer?" "I thought you'd never ask," he replied flippantly, earning him more than a few scowls from the rest of the group. "What? Somebody had to know about it. You used our leader as bait," Dida gravely intoned. "Forgive me if I do not trust you." "Well, trust is something earned," he said coyly. "And I think since she's let me into the eagle's nest, it means there's at least a little love between us." "I brought you here so you could explain," Edelgard warned. "Let's not get too ahead of ourselves, Regan." Okay, fine. Let's start with the information Lysithea sent over." "Queen, pretty please." She made a few gestures and brought up a set of schematics outlined in semi-transparent blue lines. The first one was of a small space station that looked like any other, complete with a set of solar panels and enough radiation shielding to protect its internal components. Highlighted was a communications array and the usual relay system present on any satellite uplink. Other than the various rooms and equipment storage bays noted, nothing really stood out other than the fact that it was awfully bland for a space station. There really wasn't anything in there. "This is the Upsilon space station, constructed to provide a base from which engineers can manage and maintain communication satellites," Claude explained. "It's pretty boring. I'm sure it barely hit the news when it was launched." "I am not remembering it at all," agreed Petra. "Though there is being an awful lack of detail in those schematics." "Which is their point?" He then pointed to the second schematic, which was identical to the first except in far more detail. This one had a full layout of the facilities, marred by a massive, classified, gray, covering the center. The fusion reactor in the center was the main difference, along with the number of power relays connected throughout the entire facility. Every single room was filled with some sort of power array or distributor, save for the personnel room and the center shaft that remained empty. "We recovered this from a magistrate official who we questioned," Claude said, hanging on the last word. "A lot of people died to keep this secret." "Goddess, it was such a pain to get that," Hilda complained. "You're welcome, by the way. A fusion reactor has far too much output to be used for a simple communications station." "So you are claiming that this is the hammer?" asked Didu. "It lacks the systems to create a blast of a magnitude capable of leveling a mountain." "Good point." "Didu, was it?" Claude asked, receiving a simple nod of affirmation in response. "But I have no doubt that this does not show the full picture. If I know anything about the magistrate at all, it's that they love showing half-finished diagrams to people below the right clearance levels," Geralt added. "You wouldn't happen to have the full schematic, would you?" "No. But I think, from the lack of information in the central shaft, we can guess what this station is capable of." "And we saw it firsthand," noted Edelgard. "This is the hammer." "Yes. Project Damocles is its official name, but I find that a bit too wordy for my liking. And the conspiracy theorists online are going crazy about the mythical space weapon they call the hammer, though they were already crazy about it before it was built," Claude mentioned. "Turns out a broken clock is right twice a day. Do we have any information about the weapon itself?" You noticed the elevated radiation levels, didn't you? Claude pointed out. That's the targeting beam, where it sends a small pulse of ionized radiation to the surface. Then they send a massive surge of energy through it, creating an overload of energy that results in a massive shockwave. He received a few raised eyebrows. What? I didn't understand what my operator meant by Schwarzschild manipulation and Maxwell-Boltzmann standard particle destruction. I think she dumbed it down a lot for me. We'll iron out the details later. Thank you for being reasonable, Claude. What's the public being told about this? She asked. Nothing. They're being told that Lonato set off an explosion in a cowardly attempt to kill the 12th Legion. But I think that far too many people saw a beam of light descend from the heavens for that to stick. So they're asking questions, Geralt asked gravely. Lysithea found that pretty much every single mention of it has been scrubbed off the net. But I think that with some clever work on our side, we can easily swing it in our favor. I'll have Bernadetta bypass the filter, Edelgard declared. We will show Newfoundland that the Empire does not care about them, that they were willing to kill their own soldiers in pursuit of victory. I like that, grinned Claude. A propaganda win. Sucks that we lost a mountain in the process, but it's a small price to pay. And, of course, our dearly departed governor. Lonato knew about this, didn't he? Whispered Ash. He knew, and yet still. Yes. He only confirmed my suspicions, confided Claude, and yet he still went to war knowing the odds were against him. Governor Lonato had been fighting a losing battle before he even began. If he was privy to that information, then he would have known that no matter what foothold he managed to gain in territory, it could be taken away just as easily as it had been given. A massive sword dangled above his head, above all of their heads, threatening to crush them if they ever stepped out of line. And yet he chose to fight, whether it was out of a desire for vengeance for his biological son or against the Empire itself. Foolish, yet brave nonetheless. A true knight. She remembered Catherine's words to him as they fought. Well, if it isn't the old father-in-law. You're interrupting my duel. There had to be something related to Kristoff in that remark. She hoped that Thunder Catherine was truly dead and that in his haste the God Emperor had pulled the trigger too early, but in her heart Edelgard knew that he would never be so foolish to do so. She was a hero known across the solar system. It would be a waste of a powerful soldier and a blemish on the Empire's nearly immaculate public record. If she appeared again, then Edelgard would have to dig up what she could on the woman. There was an infinitesimally slim chance she could sway Catherine to her side, but with the right words she could break her will to fight and remove another thorn in her side. She could speculate all she wanted, but perhaps the answers were right there. Her eyes flicked to the freckled young man before her, his face shrouded in sadness and weariness. Ash could provide the answers, but was he willing to cooperate at all? So we have a space station hovering over our heads, threatening to blow us to smithereens if we poke too far up on the surface, Geralt muttered, cradling the side of his head. Good grief. Makes me wish I hadn't returned to mercenary life in the first place. Can we be accessing this space station? Petra asked. I would like very greatly to blow it to, as you people say, smithereens. I agree, said Dedu. The hammer must go if we are to succeed in our rebellion. Claude snorted. Yeah, if you can hijack the space elevator in Derdriu. Good luck doing that. It makes taking Arianrod look like a cakewalk. Aren't you situated in Derdriu, Regan? Asked Geralt. I'm sure you have something in the cards, after the stunt you pulled on the mountain. Admittedly, it's not out of our reach, he sheepishly replied. I can have Ignatz talk to his contacts. Maybe Lysithea can pull off a miracle. But it'll be a while before any of that happens. I've always wanted to go to space, mused Ash. It's really not that interesting, Hilda assured him. Easy for you to say, Pillow Princess, chuckled Claude. You find a total of 3 things interesting. Space isn't exactly a vacation, she snapped back. Even if we do get in, I doubt the hammer's going to be unguarded. And how are we supposed to make our way down afterwards? That's a problem for future me. Future you is just as dumb as current you. Enough, scolded Edelgard. We have more pressing matters to attend to. Yeah, said Geralt. What I want to know is, what took you guys so damn long? We went through the abyss and we're back way before sunrise. It's 9 in the morning right now. What happened? Hilda tapped her fingernails nervously on her chair. Well, it wasn't very fun, I'll tell you that much. We ran into, shall I say, a laboratory of sorts. The monster-making kind, said Edelgard. Oh, that's a huge understatement and you know it, chided Claude. Beasts running around amok on the upper floors. A crazy woman talking about experiments. Another crazy woman throwing half the laboratory at us with gravity gloves. It was an absolute nightmare. Experiments? Didu asked, perturbed. I am being curious what these gravity gloves refer to, Petra said. We'll talk about that later, Didu, she said in the tone that meant, don't ask too many questions in front of a crowd. He nodded gravely and remained perfectly still, like a stone statue. Sometimes she wondered if he was even breathing. She could pick up objects with her hands and throw them, explained Ash. I can do that, snorted Geralt. Then his face went somber. Did she happen to have turquoise hair? Nope, said Hilda. Blondie, just like you, but prettier. She was unsure of what Geralt meant by that, but she filed it away under the things that made Geralt react strangely category in her mind. He looked almost disappointed, but before anyone else took notice his face reverted back to his standard gruff look. What Ash means she had some kind of telekinesis, Edelgard explained, which resulted in some strange looks from Petra and Geralt. Not the superpower kind, but she was wearing gloves that could manipulate objects from a distance. It is definitely something we want to look into and develop countermeasures, considering she was working for the magistrate unwillingly. If she had it, then there's no doubt they're developing that technology further. You sure need countermeasures after you nearly got your eye poked out, noted Claude. She was acutely aware that her eye was peeking out from underneath her mask, a rather risky thing to do, but at this point she was too tired to even care. Lavender eyes were a rare Hresvelg recessive gene anyway, and any ties to her civilian identity were tenuous at best. Yes, and I will have my men work on that. By men she meant Linhard, and by work she meant he would stumble upon a solution somehow in between lounging around and sleeping the day away. But it really doesn't concern the war effort at all. I am going to set up a way to extract them out of the rubble of Mount Gaspard. But I will most likely not get the Black Eagles or the Blade Breakers involved. A solo mission? That is putting yourself in far too much danger, warned Didu. I don't plan to go solo. But it's a mission I will finish without putting my men in harm's way, she replied confidently. So there's a creepy lab underneath where we were fighting, and a lady who can move things with her mind. What are our next steps? Asked Geralt. Ours. As much as I hate to admit it, the Blade Breakers are in the thick of things alongside the Black Eagles. I have no doubt that you will ask us to raise our swords under your banner once more. And you will have that opportunity when I find it, Edelgard declared. We will need to lay low for a bit. Once we gather enough intel, we can move towards infiltrating the hammer and blow it out of the sky. And when we do that, and only when, we can make moves openly again. We'll need to operate underground for a while. Good, Geralt said grimly. I do like the sunlight, but I do not like the idea of fighting through the Empire's legions again. That was a fraction of their strength, not to mention the fucking laser beam of death. Edelgard took a deep breath. Yes. It was a defeat. But a costly victory for the Empire nonetheless. Care that they have resources to bleed and we do not, intoned Didu. We do not have numbers yet, but Melis estimates a total of nearly 1,000 soldiers dead, perhaps 100 by our own hands. That is a drop in the ocean of the Empire. We must play our cards carefully, Queen of Flames. Then we will endeavor to get more resources. If we can secure some backers, some real political power alongside our guerrilla forces, then we are already a good part of the way there. In addition, we may need to work to expand our ranks. I'm sure there are plenty of people chomping at the bit to join up with the Queen of Flames, Claude quipped. You'd find a lot of support from the masses if you provide them an avenue to vent that won't get them killed immediately. You could consider that option as well, Edelgard reminded the leader of the Golden Deer. The same goes for you, Geralt. Nah, I'll pass, he said simply. That's more of your thing. Me and Regan might still be mercenary leaders, but you're the leader of a rebellion. You can inspire them, something we can't do with a blade alone. And maybe hope is the best thing they can have right now. She pondered the blade breaker's words carefully. Edelgard didn't feel inspiring at the moment, after suffering a tactical defeat at the hands of the Empire. It could have gone far worse, but even still, the sting of a loss burned like any other wound. And the ever-present looming threat above their heads did not help matters. But he was right. There was hope. Things were not doomed just yet, and now they had a plan to do so. I think that settles it. Are there any other pressing matters at hand? Ash looked like he wanted to say something, but for now held his tongue. The rest of the room remained silent. Good. Let your men know that I'll be speaking with them as soon as I wake. That goes for all of you. Get some rest. It's been a long night. I cannot thank you enough for standing by my side despite how dire the situation was. You all have served well. There were murmurs and nods of assent from the crowd. Claude, Hilda. Is everything ready to go? Yep. Vehicle and everything, Hilda winked. We'll speak more when you return to Deirdre. And though we began on quite rocky terms today, it seems we have come to an agreement about our cooperation. Well, I guess our goals align for now, so it's not so bad working with you, shrugged Claude. Thank you for not killing us immediately. She ignored that last part. Is the infirmary open? She asked Didu. Mercedes will not be ready until later today, he said. The lady is kind and gentle to a fault. She pushes herself far too much. Then I'll speak to her after she rests. We'll discuss the other matter later in time, Didu. For now, show Mr. Gaspard to his quarters. That will be all. Thank you. She bowed in deference, which was odd since she was technically in command of every single person in the room and in the complex. But they did not complain, and so Edelgard left them to her own devices as she retired to her own quarters. Edelgard's room overlooked the entire command center, accessible by a set of stairs that folded downwards when she scanned her iris to verify her identity. Normally she would have to retract the visor partially to do so, but the fact that there was a hole in her helmet made the point moot. The linear slides retracted downwards, and each step clacked into place once it hit the floor. Carefully she walked upwards, as she found that she had a tendency to fall when no one was looking. Or at least, she hoped no one had been looking. Despite being above the entire command center, it in reality wasn't too large of a room. It was about the size of her old college double, if not slightly larger. The wall that overlooked the base below was covered ceiling to floor in one-way glass, rated for even the strongest of concussive blasts. Built partially into the ceiling of the subway tunnel as a small break room for workers, it was not exactly what she would call the pinnacle of Newfoundland luxury. But it was hers, and for now it would have to make do. She suspected that she would be seeing a lot of the room once the fighting ramped up, and less of her home in the district of Inver. The bed was exactly the way she had it in her home, perfectly made out of Dusker wood, machined to precision. The sheets were still made from the last time she had slept here, on top of a mattress firm as a rock. She was a very particular sleeper in the comfort of her own home, a practice that came perhaps as a result of her imprisonment. That bed had been not much of a bed and instead a slab of concrete, which bothered her a little. She had once enjoyed fluffy beds that she could sink into, but now she found them suffocating. Before the full-size mirror, she carefully took off her helmet to reveal the woman underneath. Her minor head injuries had healed, the series of cuts she had received from the visor shattering had already sealed up, though they were barely anything of note in the first place. She laid it on the table, before undressing to check her body for any gaping wounds. Catherine had done a decent amount of damage to her body, with a minor amount of bruising around her hips and her left collarbone. But they did not ache anymore, and so she did a quick look before putting on her sleep garments. Edelgard resented looking at herself. It did not come out of a feeling of self-hatred or a desire to become somebody else, but rather from the fact that her body was forced upon her. The well-toned muscle, the scars underneath her right breast and her stomach, even the birthmark that had vanished on her left knee, they were boons that she had no say in. All she could do was leverage her strength to make a better world where no one would need to go through what she had gone through. Before she went to bed, she fired off a few quick messages to Linhard, explaining that her visor had been destroyed and she needed a replacement one. She watched as the dreaded 3 dots of death showed up, before promptly tapping off and ignoring whatever drivel he sent in return. Then she looked at her civilian line to see if Ingrid or Glenn had sent anything. Neither of them did, which was hopefully a good sign. The gnawing guilt in her heart after their fight with the Death Knight abated slightly, only to find a text message from Dorothea. "Are you okay, Edie? Call me." She quickly texted back that she was fine, but she needed some time to think. She attached a heart at the end and hoped that Dorothea wouldn't read into it too much. The last thing she needed was more people prying into her secrets, and her pile was beginning to become unbearably large. With all tasks at hand cleared, Edelgard climbed into her bed, trying desperately to sleep. But as she tossed and turned, she found that it was difficult to fall asleep with so much on her mind. Edelgard was trapped. Never before had she felt the urge to sleep, and yet she found herself unable to do so. But the more she thought, the more she grew tired, and sleep took her without any protest on her end. Edelgard was dreaming. She knew that she was dreaming, but it did not affect her motions in the slightest. She was a prisoner in her own body, if it could even be considered her own body. But this time, instead of trying to resist, she decided to go along for the ride. If whatever that little gremlin girl had said was true, then these were fragments of the truth. She had no idea what truth that was referring to, but it was a confirmation that they were indeed memories, and not just some delusions her addled brain had conjured up. It was a waste of her time to try to interfere, if what she was seeing would happen anyway. The world unfolded in a bizarre manner, fragments of night and earth reassembling themselves into a landscape devoid of any features save for the trees surrounding them. Even the moon had difficulty piercing the treeline with its pale moonlight, giving the entire area a feeling of eerie tension. 2 figures met beneath the night sky, one a human wearing a mask of porcelain and flames, the other a ghoul with the complexion of white porcelain wearing a mask of a human. "What," said the woman, "is the meaning of this?" Her voice came out in a modulated tone, though it was less of a synthesized one and more of a multilayered voice with both shrill and deep tones. There was only one person this could be. The Flame Emperor. The one who would tear the world down and recreate it anew. "We have what we needed," replied the other. His face was long and angular, with long brown hair that flowed to his chest and striking eyebrows. But no amount of facial hair and grooming could hide the sneer etched into his features, nor could it conceal the hatred he possessed for the face he wore. "The blood of the girl. And yet you had the gall to interfere, knowing that it was futile." "I had to maintain my cover," she retorted. "Are you so simple as to let Juritsar run amok down there without the appropriate precautions?" "Hush, my dear niece. I am simply reminding you of your place." His words dripped with honeyed venom, and the word niece had probably never been used with more vitriol outside of a family funeral. She could feel the woman who donned the mask of the Flame Emperor seething underneath. Her breaths came in angry huffs, letting the anger control her rather than the other way around. "Do not underestimate me." "Of course. I would never," the man smirked. "You are the Flame Emperor, our greatest creation, with the help of the fell beast's blood. Your flames will burn even the gods left unchecked. Care that they do not peter out too fast." "Are you here to punish me, then?" she snapped. "Send me to the dungeons like you did all those years ago?" "No, no. I am here to let you know that we have successfully infiltrated the monastery from within." "I assumed that I was doing that. Not to mention Solon's presence." "Another infiltration, then," he said disdainfully. "I take it you saved Monica." "The poor girl has been nothing but mad for the last few days. Incessantly annoying. It's as if she's become an entirely different Pradesh." The Flame Emperor paused in the middle of her sentence. "Suthi's damn it all. You've replaced her." She spat out the last part. "You understand, do you not? Let Monica keep your baser impulses in check and serve as a reminder. You are only alive because of us. And should you stray too far from our path," he chuckled, "you may find a dagger plunged into your own back." "How dare you," she growled, moving to unsheath her axe. "Perhaps, dear niece, you should focus more on keeping that nasty temper in check rather than what we do or do not dare to do. At any rate, the experiments in Remire are proceeding accordingly. With any luck, Solon will have his breakthrough, and you will have your weapons to wage your war." "I do not want your weapons," she seethed. But even Edelgard could tell that was a lie, born out of anger. "You simply do not have a choice," replied the man coolly. "Sleep well, my dear niece. Perhaps you will dream of your siblings once more. Or will it be your mother, this time?" He let out a muted cackle, simply to spite the woman before him. With a flash of purple light the man and his laughter vanished, leaving the woman clenching her fists so hard that blood began to drip from where her nails had pierced her skin through her gloves. There was a quiet sobbing, the kind that came when one was resigned to despair beyond any return. Like so many people, she was a prisoner trapped inside the complex machinations of another. In its place came another flash of purple light revealing a man with gaunt, sunken eyes and messy black hair. She knew exactly who this was without having to guess. Hubert von Vestra. The only man who she trusted with her life utterly completely. Or at least, she had trusted. But in her memories, it seemed that her trust did not waver. "Lady Edelgard. Are you all right?" "Quiet," she snarled. "You have no idea who may be listening." Her breaths came in shallow gasps, muffled underneath the stifling mask she wore. "That does not matter as of the moment." "Did he hurt you?" Hubert's words were tinged with anger, and as if on command spikes of ice began to form from his fingertips. "Not physically. He only proved that your theory was correct," she muttered. "We were foolish to believe we could change anything by saving Flane and Monica." "Damn him," Hubert growled. "Fools we may be, but perhaps it was the right thing to do. Do not let Arundel get under your skin, that is exactly what he wants. He desires a puppet that he can enact his desires through, but my lady, you are so much more dash." "Stop it, Hubert," she snapped. "I am nothing. I am sorry. But we must go." He reached out a hand draped in a white glove, which she instinctively slapped away. Hubert looked hurt, his face contorting in a confused expression. Seeing her retainer's face, she reluctantly extended her hand and let her take it. In an instant they disappeared once more, leaving the forest empty of any life save for a single chirping cricket. It was as if no one had ever been there in the first place. Two things occurred to Edelgard. One, that it had been a conversation between Edelgard and her uncle. Arundel had never been particularly notable in her memories, but here he seemed to be more sinister than even she expected. The way he hung on the word niece suggested that he had been replaced just like the Monica they were referring to. But perhaps if there was a connection here, then it would be by investigating her uncle in her own time. Arundel had gone into hiding after the tragedy of Dusker, and the Arundel family had long been swallowed up and destroyed by other conglomerates. If there was a possibility that he had something to do with it, then clearly he had gotten what he deserved. The second was the mask of the Flame Emperor itself. In every world, she dimly thought, she wore a ridiculous get-up designed to hide her identity. It was a delicious irony that this one was an emperor and not a queen like herself, so resigned had her past counterpart been to the fate of the throne that she was already masquerading as one far before her coronation. And there were the heels. She supposed that she would have been just as diminutive as her counterpart had she not been cut open, reassembled, and cut open again by the magistrate. But she did not have a choice, and that was the difference between Edelgard and Edelgard. She supposed that her agency was a blessing, and that perhaps this fateful meeting under the shroud of darkness was meant to be a warning. Join with evil, and you may find yourself unable to stomach what you must do in their name. And if you commit evil to destroy a greater evil, how much blood are you willing to have on your conscience before you relent? The words, though she knew not where they came from, echoed through her mind as she drifted in her dreamscape. Then reality began to leak through her eyelids, as she found herself yearning for just a little more of the sweet embrace of sleep. "Thank you, all, for lending your sword to my cause." She stood in half armor, using a vibromask in place of her dearly departed helmet, addressing nearly 60 black eagles and blade breakers gathered in the command center. Shapes and figures of all sizes stood at attention, some still bandaged from the day before, and others holding their weapons as they would hold a drink. Never before had she felt so tiny in front of a crowd, and so she let her voice swell and gave the most rousing speech she could muster. "I will not mince words. Today was a tactical defeat in the face of overwhelming firepower. But we gave no quarter, and fought the 12th Legion of the Empire tooth and nail for every little square inch on that mountain. And though we were unsuccessful in saving Lonato or capturing Catherine, We were successful enough that we forced the Empire's trump card. She let the schematic of the hammer flicker on the screen behind her. By raising Mount Gaspard with the device known as the hammer, the God Emperor has shown his people that he does not care for their well-being. Civilian casualties are in the hundreds, and the estimated Legion casualties are well over 1,000. It is a grim reminder of what we fight for, if not a testament to the evil of the Empire. Lonato was a good man, she continued, her eyes falling on his one and only remaining son. In his honor, we will continue to fight. And though the hammer still looms above our heads, we will not stop in our endeavor to topple a solar empire. We will endure. And when the time comes, we will crush the hammer and all of the tools of oppression the Empire holds us down with. She raised her fist, and led the men in a disorganized cheer. Edelgard could feel the mood of the room shift where it had been somber and downplayed beforehand, now it was fiery and riled up. That was how she knew her speeches were having an effect, though it was a bit dampened by the mask that she wore. You are all Black Eagles now. Whether or not you wear my colors or Geralt's, as long as you fight by my side I will treat you no differently. I only ask that you continue to put the same trust in me as I do you all, so that we may find victory and topple the accursed God Emperor from his high throne. She paused for a brief second to catch her breath. Today was a setback but not an utter and total defeat. And with it, we now have the tools from which we can use to wrest control of our future from the magistrate. Again, thank you all for being here. Celebrate yourselves, who laid a legion low on its knees in humiliation. And celebrate those who will never be going home. That is all. She stepped down from the raised platform to cheers and shouts. Edelgard could not let the applause of her men get to her and change her mind about things. While they were not disposable, they also were pawns in a much larger game. It was simple pragmatism by which she kept their loyalty, and it would also be pragmatism if she sacrificed them for the greater good. But for now, she supposed that patience was a virtue, and by biding her time she could keep herself in their good graces and not have too many of their deaths on her conscience just yet. Ash, she said, calling out to the boy. Walk with me. He obliged silently, and she led him through a hallway branch from the main corridor. After a brief minute of walking, he turned to face the Queen of Flames. His eyes were puffy, and his face was etched in a permanent frown, something that looked odd with his boyish features. He had certainly not been sleeping well in the span of a day. He had lost his father, and the closest thing to a home he had. What is it, Queen of Flames? He asked. You know Yuri Leclerc, don't you? She stated calmly. He flinched at that, a dead giveaway even if he intended to say something different. Sort of. Sort of. We keep correspondence. Does Lonato know? Lonato believed I was sending a message to a friend of mine, an old retainer of House Rowe. This is true. What? Edelgard said, confused. Yuri was a member of House Rowe. It's a long story, he said sheepishly. How did you meet him? Don't tell me you were hanging around Leclerc's, she muttered darkly. If that son of a bitch tells me he's been dash. No, Ash said curtly. He took care of me, back when I was a street urchin. He gave me odd jobs and a place to stay. All I'm doing is simply entertaining an old friend. Ah. That made more sense. Makes sense, then. I suppose people would kill for that kind of dirt on Yuri, but it isn't really dirt if it makes him more human, she chuckled. We'll be visiting Abyss in a couple hours. Grab a bike from the vehicle bay, and meet me at the rendezvous point there. Understood. But dash. No buts, she chided. If Yuri knows something about Happy and Constance, then we need to move quickly. Am I making myself clear? Yes, he said wearily. She wondered if he had been sleeping at all, and a part of her felt guilty for pushing him like that so soon after his father's death. But it was a coping mechanism to throw oneself into work soon after tragedy, and she wondered if it would help on the young Gaspard man. I understand. Good. Help yourself to whatever you need. You're a temporary Black Eagle for now. And with that, she took her leave, leaving a befuddled and confused Ash in the hallway as she searched for the corridor leading to the infirmary. A knot of dread that formed in her stomach only served to confirm the feeling of uneasiness that grew once she approached the door that led to where the sick and dying remained. But it was not the guilt of having caused her men's injuries, it was the guilt that accompanied the woman taking care of them. Edelgard was going to have to tell Mercedes about the Death Knight. And if what she suspected of Mercedes was true, then they were both in for a world of pain and suffering. Chapter 33, Look into the Abyss. As she stepped into the infirmary, she was bothered by how quiet it was. It was an eerie silence, punctuated only by the sound of soft breathing and the beeping of early monitors that were out of sync. She counted 10 people who were currently lying in hospital beds that she had bought many years ago, all with varying degrees of injury. Bandages that were crimson in color covered their wounds, ranging from shallow cuts on their foreheads to missing limbs altogether. Edelgard winced at that in the age of cybernetics, a missing limb was not what it once was, but it was a harrowing injury nonetheless. Many a wizened mercenary spoke of phantom sensations and the yearning for flesh rather than a cold, artificial limb where there are more leg had been once. Leonie waved at her when she walked in from her bed. "Heya, Queen. Glad to see you drop by and check on us poor souls." She was flippant as ever, unfazed by the bandages covering her head as if it were a bandana. From what Gerald had told her in a brief chat, she had gone down taking a blow meant for her subordinate and received a concussion. It was probably on the lighter side of injuries, but Mercedes had ordered her to remain in the infirmary until she got a proper night's worth of rest. Traumatic brain injuries could be worse than missing limbs or damaged organs. They could be replaced with steel, but there was no replacing the mind. "Hello, Leonie," she said, smiling underneath her mask. "How are you holding up?" "Better," she huffed. "I'm hoping to clear us out in the next few days and use our hideout in Remire. I do like your base, but I think putting too many eggs in one basket is unwise. Or at least, that's what Gerald says anyways. Take as much time as you need." "How are the rest of them?" "Bolin, Cassius, and Reuben are missing a hand, foot, and leg respectively. I wish they hadn't gotten careless," she sighed, "but it's better than bringing them back in a body bag." She recognized their sleeping forms several feet from her, and it did pain her to see the results of their battle firsthand. Casualties were a given, but it was different seeing them on paper versus seeing them firsthand. "A fair point," Edelgard agreed. "I will see to it that they are given everything they need." "Where is Mercedes?" "Sleeping in the storage room," Leonie snorted. She jabbed a thumb half-heartedly behind her. "Why is the Saint of the Abyss here, anyway? Shouldn't she have better things to do than saving a bunch of low-life mercs?" "It's her calling to help people in need," Edelgard replied wryly. "And she agrees with our cause. You've seen Abyss and what it's like. The magistrate simply doesn't care for them." "Well, I'm not complaining," Leonie muttered. "She's a lifesaver, all right. Surely we can't hire her for some of our gigs." "Only if you could afford it," she said with a chuckle, which made Leonie grin in response. "Let me know if you need anything." "Of course. Oh, and thanks for everything as usual." She flashed a thumbs up, and then slumped back in her bed to continue resting. Edelgard slipped past the beds toward the storage room, which she gingerly opened to reveal stacks and stacks of medical equipment. There were antiseptic bandages, burn ointment, vulneraries, cast printers, and even a small surgery robot scattered about the high shelves. And leaned against a wall was a slightly older woman in a shawl, dozing away the day away with a cloth placed between her head and a metal support pillar. Her blonde hair draped against her face, though it seemed less serene and more in anguish. It was the reverse of what it had been all those years ago, back when Edelgard wandered the streets of Inver delirious and babbling. Though Mercedes had taken her in out of the kindness of her heart, she felt as if she was a burden on the girl. Here she was, about to graduate medical school, and yet she spent her time doting on a girl who could barely say her name without breaking down. She knew Mercedes saw her nightmares and she would always wake to find herself in the comforting embrace of Mercedes, who was usually asleep and drooling. But for the first time, she was the one witnessing Mercedes in her nightmares. Edelgard wasn't even aware she had any. "Emil," she muttered deliriously. "Emil, don't stay." Her forehead was covered in sweat, and she was rocking back and forth. If she jerked awake, then there was a chance she would hit a shelf and have it collapse on top of her. Or maybe that was just Edelgard trying to justify waking her for her own selfish ambitions. After all, Mercedes had woken her from one nightmare, and that was probably the last time she ever did. She gently walked in front of her friend and knelt down. "Mercedes," she whispered, giving her a small shake. Instantly her blue eyes opened, and an expression of anger flitted across her face for an instant before it quickly returned to a serene demeanor. She realized that it reminded her of someone, and for a second she could not place who it was. Then she remembered the night at Mara, the blood splattered across the man's face, the blue eyes and blonde hair that had belonged to someone far too familiar for her own liking. Everything from the cheekbones to her eyebrows was a pale mirror of the man underneath the mask that night. But what made it all too real was the way her anger seethed underneath the skin, beneath an otherwise blank expression. Edelgard hadn't wanted to believe it, but she also didn't believe in coincidences. The Death Knight and Mercedes were connected. By blood, perhaps? The ramifications of something like that chilled her to the bone, and suggested that her friend was deeper in the thick of things than she had ever planned for. The way her demeanor changed when she mentioned the Death Knight, the subtle bursts of emotion, all of it pointed to the fact that Mercedes von Martritz knew something. But she had little time to ponder it as the woman in front of her shook her head and assessed the person who had so rudely awoken her. "Oh. It's you," she said quietly. She paused for a moment, unsure how to address the elephant in the room before choosing not to for now. "Are you okay?" Edelgard asked. "You were having an awful nightmare." "I was, yes," Mercedes said blankly. She wiped a bit of sweat off her forehead before Edelgard offered her one of the fresh towels on the storage racks. She graciously accepted, wiping her chestnut hair and her forehead until she was perfectly dry. The time spent helping had not been kind on Mercedes von Martritz, as like many of her black eagles sported bags underneath her eyes and a chronic weariness that never seemed to quite go away. She supposed that it was probably quite like medical school for the woman, with nights of little to no sleep and a never-ending workload. Perhaps the difference was that here, she could actually help people rather than go through the motions of learning how to do so. "You didn't answer my question." "Are you all right?" she asked once more. "I've been better. Besides, I know how to deal with a nightmare," she said wistfully, "considering you had one every night for that whole year. Do you want to talk about it?" She raised an eyebrow. "Mercedes," she chided. "You took care of me, and I can never thank you enough. Let me take care of you for once." "Oh, you don't have to, Queen." Mercedes corrected herself before anyone else noticed. She looked behind Edelgard to see if anybody was listening, but either way she was not going to risk having her identity slip because of her friend. "I'll be quite all right." She put on a smile as if to make a point, but it only came out pained and forced. Edelgard sighed, shaking her head in disbelief. They were quite alike, she realized. Both of the two women were stubborn. They would try to help others and change the world, without first helping themselves. There was a darkness in both of them, though for Edelgard it was far more obvious. One saved lives, while the other took them without hesitation. "I'll take you home once you're done here," she offered. "Are you done here?" "Yes," Mercedes replied. "Everyone's stable. Aloran and the Manzotho girl should be able to take care of the rest. And I've left detailed instructions for them to follow. And I've also set up a direct comm link so that they can call me if they mess up. Leave it to the Saint of the Abyss to make sure every possible thing was accounted for." She left nothing to chance when it came to her patients. And what others proscribed to the miracles of a saint, Edelgard instead knew that it came from hard work in a kind hand. Mercedes was far too kind for her own good. She knew that people took advantages of her services, but she didn't care. All she wanted was to help people, though it certainly didn't help that they paid her a small fortune for her services and discretion. Those that could pay paid, while those that could not simply owed her small favors. She usually cashed them in by making them run errands for her, though for the truly unfortunate she worked out of the kindness of her own heart. "Good. If you're done here, we have a lot to discuss." "What?" Mercedes asked gently. "Is it the nightmares again? Or Glenn calling and asking about you?" She slapped her head in exasperation. "Damn it. I knew I shouldn't have said anything to him. Of course Glenn was actually making good on his promise. She almost hoped that he had forgotten about it. It's fine. I don't really know him very well, other than he's my friend's boyfriend's brother. Met him at a party once. Handsome guy," she said, except that he's engaged. Engaged to my friend, Edelgard said, slightly annoyed. What did you tell him, Mercy? I told him he had the wrong number and hung up. Edelgard laughed bitterly. He's not falling for that. Call him back later. Why? I made a deal with him. Her eyes flickered around, suddenly acutely aware there was only a silencer separating them from the rest of the Black Eagles. Is that what you wanted to talk about, then? She whispered. There's a bit more than that we need to discuss. In private. Oh, lovely. The Queen of Flames wants to talk with me. If I were anybody else, she muttered, they would find my body in a random tunnel, never to be seen again. I don't do that to everyone, Edelgard retorted. But you do it to some people. Within reason. Looks like I have a new spooky story to tell, she said, cracking a faint smile. At that, Edelgard rolled her eyes and shook her head. For someone who saved so many lives, Mercedes had an unhealthy obsession with telling ghost stories. At first they were rather awful, but as the years passed Edelgard found that they were actually beginning to be scary. She supposed that if the supposedly unfazable Queen of Flames shivered at her stories, then her patients would probably pass out in terror. One of these days, you're going to give a patient a heart attack, she grumbled. Oh, that's fine. I have a defibrillator for that, so I can finish the story. Edelgard face-palmed in exasperation. Whatever. How'd you even get here? I took the train. Her eyes nearly popped out of her head. You took the train? Yep. Walked to the surface, took the train, slipped in through the Mina entrance under the cat cafe. Oh Suthies, she swore. What if someone followed you? Hell, what if the magistrate followed Dash? It's okay, reassured Mercedes. I'm always perceptive of my surroundings. And I'm perfectly happy to send some new patients to my clinic. She gestured to a dagger hanging from underneath her shawl, which swung underneath the cloth. Mercedes, you are the strangest woman I know, Edelgard muttered, which was saying a lot considering what she had seen underneath Mount Gaspard. You're coming with me. No buts. But Dash. What did I just say? You're in my base. I make the decisions here. She sighed in defeat. Fine. But only if we pick up some baking ingredients on the way there. I'm running a rebellion, not your personal delivery. I'll go order some for you. Perfect. Mercedes grinned, and Edelgard was starting to suspect that ordering for her had been her plan all along. The woman was airheaded and enthusiastic about the strangest things, but when she wanted something she could be cunning as a viper. Mercedes might not have been her real mother, but she certainly could not ask for a better surrogate mother. Ash, she radioed over the comms. What's your status? Getting ready to head over, Queen of Flames. I won't let you down. Do that, and let me know when you get there. Queen out. She cut off the comm link while her passenger lazily yawned on the back of her hoverbike. The tunnels of Abyss were not exactly the most ideal for going on a joyride, since they consisted of relatively straight lines intersecting at odd angles with monotonous scenery. But it was where she spent most of her time, and so she had made her peace with it. It certainly beat walking. Mercedes clung onto her waist with both hands, which was covered in a relatively bland dress that she reserved for her trips into Abyss. This time, however, she made use of her colored contacts in combination with a hollow mask that shrouded the bottom part of her face. Covering up her lavender eyes helped deter any face recognition software or being recognized by a lecherous noble, both possibilities in Abyss. And she also wanted to test the recording software on her lenses, since it was probably going to come in handy once she talked with Yuri Leclerc. What did you want to talk about? Mercedes crooned. Would you happen to know a Jurat Saw? Edelgard asked bluntly. No. Am I supposed to know one? You asked if I knew who the Death Knight was, after he sent me your way. She continued to keep her eyes peeled towards the darkness ahead of her, navigating each of the turns with expert dexterity. I think I know. You ran into him again, didn't you? She said bitterly. Yes. And when were you planning to tell me that? Her grip clenched into Edelgard's dress, and though it was not enough to make her lose control, it was still disconcerting. Mercedes, you know I've been quite busy. You've been quite busy, with all your patience. And I didn't. I wanted to tell you when everything died down. What happened, she said icily. Tell me. And there was the darkness again. She did not pry into Mercedes and her past after all, she was a guest in her house. But she could tell that the woman was deeply troubled, and perhaps helping people was her way of coping. Whatever it was, it had to do with the face underneath the grimly visage of the Death Knight. Edelgard did not keep secrets from her friend, but perhaps it was time to pry a little bit. We ran into him. Where? Clubbing. Don't joke with me. I wish I was, sighed Edelgard. She swerved to avoid a piece of metal that would just barely clip the bottom of the bike. More trash littered around the tunnels, probably from a fight gone wrong. I was with some of my university friends a couple nights ago. The idol, right? And the Lance girl. Mercedes was of course, referring to Dorothea and Ingrid, both of which she had never met in person. But she had heard of them, both from what they spoke about in the news and. Yes. We fought him off the best we could, but Ingrid lost her hand in the process. I almost died and there were plenty who were not so lucky. Oh. Her tone softened. I'm so sorry. It's fine, she said dismissively, finding a sudden interest in the topology of the road ahead as she stared downwards. She's not dead. That's all that matters. You said you saw his face. I almost killed him, Edelgard whispered quietly. I broke his faceplate and nearly caved his skull in. And his face dash. She sucked in a deep breath. Mercedes. He looked like you. Of course he did, Mercedes said wistfully. He always did take after mother. What? I think I should start from the beginning. The whirring of the hoverbike had never felt louder to Edelgard. Under a false concrete sky they plunged through the darkness, as she tried her best to keep her eyes peeled for any threats lurking in the bowels of Newfoundland. But she could not and would not keep her thoughts away from her friend. She gently let Mercedes muster up the courage to speak, though she was certainly taking her sweet time. But judging from her breaths, she was uncharacteristically hesitant. I had a brother, Mercedes whispered. A very long time ago. He was sweet and kind, and he would never hurt a fly. My real father died when I was 2 years old. I don't remember his face. Just a few old pictures, and his face on the company wall where he worked. The only thing I have left is his name Martritz. Supposedly it's a noble family, but I never felt like a noble. I was always just the product of a dead father and a desperate mother, who raised one precocious child with the meager fortune he left behind. Soon it ran out, and so my mother found an opportunity that she simply could not pass up, a man by the surname of Bartels, who I was to refer to as father. You see, he wanted an heir and my mother was a beautiful woman. She would give him one, in exchange for his protection and his money. He was an influential businessman and we needed to have a roof over our heads, so she gave her body and her soul to a man that cared only for the former. But she was far past her prime, and they only had one child before she could not have any more. But he wanted more. There was an age when I realized what he was doing to her. How she sobbed at night when he was soundly asleep, how tightly she hugged me and my brother. Oh, right. My brother, Emil. My half-brother by technicality, but we were closer than just sharing a mother. He was younger by 3 years, but as the years passed he was more of my twin than a younger brother. Emil was my other half. If I was mischievous, then he was the golden child. Oh, there were so many memories of reading books together, curling up on the couch and watching holodramas, and playing princess and knight. He was better than me at games most of the time, but I didn't care. I just wanted to play with him. My father didn't care for the most part, and left us alone until he wanted something from us. At first, all he wanted was an heir, and an heir he received. But he wanted more. He never stopped wanting more. There's a lot I'd rather not talk about. Parts of my childhood were like a dream, others were nightmares from the deepest depths of Alel itself. But my favorite memories were of my brother as we played and laughed and sang together. And there was my mother, hovering in the background, watching us to make sure I didn't burn down the house or get mud all over my clothes. But never my father. I wish I could say things changed for the better. They did not. He became colder, more anxious about his legacy, paranoid like a dragon hoarding his wealth. Mother was bruised and beaten more often than not, and she no longer began to hide her sobbing. Emile became cold and withdrawn. I didn't understand why. And when I asked, all I earned was a scar on my left arm that I still have today. I hated him. I hated him so much that I could not even say his name. He deserved to burn in the fiery pits of Alel for what he had done to us. We were nothing but cattle, breeding stock for him to produce the heir he wanted. I prayed to the goddess for guidance from my real father, and for a while, my faith wavered when I wondered why she had taken him from me only to have an evil man take his place. When I was 14, Mother made plans to escape. She would flee in the dead of night, when the security system of the Bartles mansion conveniently underwent a single minute of maintenance every night. And she would do so while bringing along her 2 children, 2 naive children, willingly blind to the horrors of the world around us. We knew that even if we did make our escape, Father would hunt us down for the rest of our days with every penny he had. And yet she still schemed. Is it in our nature to fight against the impossible? To try to survive at all costs, even when doing so is a more hopeless existence than simply submitting. I think my mother believed so. And so we made our escape, meticulously planned down to the last floorboard. She was a shrewd woman. People often mistook her beauty for vapidness. It was a mistake people only made once, and it was a lesson I took to heart. That night, it all went wrong so quickly. Mercedes. What? We stopped. You can get off now. Oh. Oh, I'm so sorry. I was so caught up in my story that I forgot where we were. Edelgard carefully parked her bike 200 feet from a hidden entrance into the district of Abyss, engaging the parking brake along with activating its passive camouflage. While she had been driving, she also had been listening to her friend open up about her past, and she thought she heard a sniffle or two in there. Things that never made sense about Mercedes began to fall into place as she told her story: who the portrait on the wall of her home was, why there was a jagged scar that ran up and down her left bicep, and why she was so dreadfully cheery all of the time. She began to understand that the Saint of Abyss was not a saint by nature. She had been made that way, forged in the crucible of trauma and tragedy. There were gaps in her story, and she doubted that Mercedes would spill all her secrets so easily. But it seemed that the Death Knight, if he really was her brother, had brought all of those memories bubbling to the surface. Edelgard resisted the urge to try to help her and fix things, and instead focused on being an attentive listener. That was her problem. She always wanted to solve the problem before anything else, and it made her callous and headstrong. Sometimes, Edelgard understood, people aren't looking for an opinion or a solution, they simply want to be heard. The best she could do was comfort her friend. It's all right, Edelgard said gently. You can finish when we get back to your clinic. She carefully laid her glove on top of Mercedes's hand, and eased her off the bike. She sniffled slightly, even if she hadn't been crying outright. That's a good idea. I think I need a break. Hey. We have all the time in the world, she encouraged. Take as much as you need. I really don't think that's true, Edelgard, but all right. Names, she hissed. Sorry. She whispered a quiet apology and followed Edelgard as they walked into town. Abyss District was even more rowdy than usual. The presence of enforcers was quite muted, meaning that people were free to do as they pleased without any chance of being stopped or randomly searched. This came with downsides, however, as they were a necessary evil to keep order. In their place were mercenary bands, their weapons on full display as they guarded various establishments and places of gathering. She recognized some of the colors they wore as she walked: a brilliant purple for Berlings, black for the swords of the goddess, blue and red for Dolmen, and even orange for the Scarlet Scourge. The presence of the last one was mildly concerning: either they flew Miklon's banner in his memory, or he had not been adequately dealt with. None of them were particularly loyal, and aside from the swords they fought for credits alone. It also meant that none of them were worthy of being by her side, though she would not turn away help from an enemy of her enemy. They kept a mild semblance of order, which meant the usual bustling evening activity scattered throughout the streets. Drunken revelers stumbled through, trailed by a few prospecting pickpockets who knew that a fool and his credits were easily parted. She saw a bit too many public displays of affection to make her mildly uncomfortable, and she suspected that given a few hours, it would go far beyond that. But most importantly, people talked in the streets. Sure, there were a few enforcers here or there, but they were hardly enough to keep up with how many people there were in Abyss District. Without the ever-present threat of the magistrate cracking down on loose lips and seditious sentiment, people were free to speak as they pleased. The district had always been noisy and cramped, but now it felt alive. "Did you hear?" someone whispered in earshot. "They blew up the entire mountain just to kill the Queen of Flames. Mount Gaspard is completely gone." "That's bullshit," a husky voice replied. "They have legions for that. And wouldn't something like that be on the news?" "No, it's true. I saw the laser blast from the sky. And they're saying the Black Eagles beat back 3 legions, and the Queen of Flames fought Thunder Cather into a standstill." "Take your fucking meds," another voice interrupted. "That would never happen." "Chen's right," said someone else in a calmer tone. As she walked past the group, she took note of the man who was speaking at the moment. His hair was a vibrant shade of violet, inhuman in nature, and striking in appearance. He had a smaller build, and a pair of twin swords hung at his side. The purple insignia and accents on his gunmetal armor meant that he served under Captain Berlin. Edelgard had never heard of such a mercenary, but he certainly left an impression based off of appearance alone. All of Berlin saw the laser. Would the Empire really fire a weapon like that if they were winning? I don't think so. Does that mean we can finally come out into the open? Nah, said a woman in a long trench jacket dismissively. The Queen of Flames is dead. And with her, any plan for a rebellion dies with her. All we can do is wait for a better chance. Edelgard ushered Mercedes along and let the conversation fade into the background. She made a turn away from the town square, toward a smaller road where paper lanterns were strung between 2 buildings. Stalls faded away to various establishments plastered with neon signs, shining various colors of green, purple, and orange. They ranged from advertising weapons, sold discreetly, various stimulants meant to boost battle performance, also sold discreetly, and a small deli, which didn't need to be discreet at all. Her eyes flickered back and forth between people as she walked, identifying potential threats and trying to move away from them when possible. The last thing she needed was to draw attention right now. They walked out of the narrow street into a small clearing near Mercedes's clinic. It was a small park, brimming with light from the artificial sun lamps installed in each corner. But there were no children playing in the artificial turf, nor were there people enjoying the light and resting. There instead, was a single man perched against a tree. He was mostly unkempt, in clothes that were one size too big for him. His hair was an odd color of green, and hung in long locks that were messily draped over a simple jacket. The only thing that made him stand out as not particularly destitute was a small gold band on his forehead, the center of which was emblazoned with a symbol she recognized faintly. He looks rather familiar, Edelgard mused. The man was somewhere in his 40s or 50s, with a beard that was beginning to be more unruly than anything else. His eyes were shrunken in shadow, and while he wasn't the most destitute person she had ever seen, looking at him gave her a sinking feeling of helplessness in her heart. How? He never comes out, Mercedes asked. I don't know. I just get the feeling that I know him. Well, she said, tapping her chin. As far as the records go, he's a John Doe. He's been here longer than I've been alive. And no one really pays him any attention at all. One of the local bookstores gave him a job as assistant in exchange for room and board, but there's only so much they can do for someone who barely says a word. Why this guy in particular? Barely says anything, huh? She looked at the man, still staring wistfully out at the grass before him. There was something utterly inhuman about him, and it reminded her of the girl in the tank for some reason. He was covered from head to toe with barely an inch of skin showing, leaving only a small set of scars around the base of his head. You usually don't blink twice at people like this, she pointed out. What changed? I'm going to find out, Edelgard said, as she mustered up the courage to walk over where he was sitting, sprawled out by the base of the half-artificial oak tree. She positioned herself in his field of view to see if the man would react. But he simply kept on gazing out at the world, ignoring the woman before him shrouded in shadow. You there, she said. What's your name? There was no answer. She knelt down from a respectful distance, and tried her best to make eye contact. His eyes shimmered a brilliant shade of green, and as they flickered onto her they seemed to glow for a bit. It was barely imperceptible, but his iris turned a faint shade of red. Suddenly he shot forward, and grabbed Edelgard by the shoulders in a quick motion. "Oh no!" Mercedes shouted, but she raised her hand to signal her to stop. She didn't come closer, and instead held her hands up to her cheeks in a gesture of exaggerated surprise. "Desecrator! I knew Lady Rhea should have never taken you in," he muttered quietly. His grip wavered as he shook, but his hands were weak and feeble. Normally she would have broken his arm for touching her, but she had the feeling that there was nothing lecherous about his sudden movement. The man wasn't even looking at her, he was just desperately staring out into space, eyes flickering between imaginary points of focus. "Who's Rhea?" she said quizzically. "You stole everything from me, but I had nothing to begin with. Only my daughter, my poor daughter, and once again, they've taken her." She frowned. He was a madman. What in the goddess's name was he talking about? "Please, find her. Please. She's the only thing I have left." Her eyes narrowed in annoyance, and she chastised herself for wasting her time. "I think you have the wrong person. I'm sorry for bothering you, sir." She tried to get up and brush his hands off, but his grip tightened. Whatever weakness he had shown was now replaced by iron conviction, firmly holding her down. "Flame Emperor. I loathe you. I despise you. Yet perhaps you were right about Ciros, and that we were never meant to inherit Fodlan at all." Edelgard willed herself to rise, brushing him off and sending him tumbling to the ground. It was a small fall on soft grass, and so he slowly leaned back against the tree and continued to stare out into oblivion. She recognized the look in his eyes. He was a survivor. Whatever he had seen had broken him, and that was why he was spouting gibberish. Flame Emperor, was that the name they had called her in her memories? Maybe he hadn't been speaking gibberish after all. As she left him to his own devices and walked toward Mercedes, her mind began racing. How did he know? Was it that he knew who the Queen of Flames was, or did he know who she was in another world? Then the ringing started. Pain shot through her synapses, blurring her vision and forcing her to her knees. She bit her lip to try to keep herself together, but all it did was leave the salty taste of blood on her tongue. Everything was tumbling down. She struggled to even breathe, and though it soon subsided, the single second of pure agony was enough to leave her reeling on the ground. "Are you all right?" Mercedes ran, checking to see if she was harmed. She grabbed her arm and head to check, but by that time Edelgard had begun to get to her feet. "Goddess," she spat, spitting out crimson flecks that stained the green beneath her. Mercedes helped her up gently as she brushed off her shoulders where he had grabbed her, as if it was dirt on her clothes. Her head still ached, but she managed to stand properly. "Is it a heart attack? Stroke? Aneurysm?" I don't think so," she managed to get out. "But it wasn't the old man's fault. I can see that. What were you trying to accomplish by talking to him, anyway?" she chided. "Did your mother never give you the 'don't talk to strange old men' talk?" Her voice was a sing-songy lilt, mocking Edelgard and her strange choice of conversation partners. "Stop," she muttered, turning a fierce shade of red. "But now I understand a little more about who he is, even if there's so little to go off of." Her gaze turned back to the old man, who was staring at the two of them, or more accurately, through them. She felt an overwhelming sense of pity for the man who had seemingly lost everything, reduced to a gibbering madman. But there was truth in his words, and there had to be some of his sanity left in there. She wondered if the magistrate had done this to him, and she wouldn't be very surprised if they had. The gnawing feeling of guilt in her heart, that lurked for some unforeseen reason, suggested that there was more to the story than that. "I don't really get it," her friend said, "but maybe we should go." "Keep an eye out for him," Edelgard asked, "will you?" She raised an eyebrow. "You have strange tastes in men." "Don't joke," she replied coldly. "Whatever he knows, whatever he's doing here, I will find out." And what remained unspoken was that she would do whatever was necessary to find out, even if it meant harming the old man. The strange man sitting by the tree soon faded into the background of the abyss, as they continued on her way to where Mercedes's clinic was. His name just barely eluded her thoughts. If she didn't know any better, Edelgard would have believed that someone was intentionally keeping it from her. And the constant bait and switch when it came to her strange dreams and memories was beginning to anger her more than it proved useful. "Now will you continue your story?" Edelgard asked. They were sitting in the apartment situated above the clinic, accessible by a staircase guarded day and night by both her receptionist and her security guard. It was a relatively small apartment with only a single bedroom and a small kitchen, paid for by the meager salary the Saint of Abyss lived on. The furniture was mismatched but of high quality, considering the majority of them were gifts from the people she operated on. Mercedes was not exactly the most decorative of people, but at least her apartment always smelled like warm cookies and flour. Edelgard lounged lazily on a sofa as she checked her holodeck for Ash's status. He was due to arrive in 15 minutes by motorcycle, escorted by Monique to ensure his safety. Though the son of Lonato Gaspard was technically an adult, his naivete could pose a problem in a fight. Normally she would have brought him to Abyss herself, but her friendship with Mercedes mattered more than his safety. Selfish, but it was the truth. "I'll see how far I'll get," Mercedes replied, cracking open a beer. She gently motioned for Edelgard to take one, which she shook her head at. Tonight was a work night, she couldn't afford to be drunk until after her meeting with Yuri. "It's been quite a while since we did story time, Edie. Your ghost stories were awful," she said dryly. "Ah, because they were too scary for the big bad Queen of Flames. I find that telling ghost stories to a newly orphaned teenager is not the greatest of coping mechanisms, but I guess it's part of your charm," Edelgard said, smiling. "I had to find something to pass the time." "You weren't talking when I found you," she recalled wistfully. "Not even a peep." "The napkin worked, didn't it?" "It was awfully inconvenient to have to read a napkin every time you wanted to say something, but yes. It did work. And now look at us." Edelgard gestured to the two of them, lounging around as if they were nothing more but old friends catching up. "A saint and a demon. How far we've come in 7 years." "I'm not feeling particularly saint-like today," Mercedes mused. "But anyway. Story time. Story time. Well, where'd we leave off?" Emil would not leave. Though my mother and I did not want to admit it, we knew that Bartles would chase us to our graves if it meant restoring his honor. And he had no shortage of mercenaries or assassins to call upon, either. We would live the rest of our lives running. Emil knew he always knew better than both of us. Goddess, I was so mad when he tried to stay. The clock had just struck midnight. We were in our assigned positions, and were just about to meet our mother outside when he told me. I was about half a second away from slapping him senseless. I screeched his name as quietly as I could while still conveying my anger. Was he stupid? I remembered asking him. Why would he make a joke like that, when we were this close to freedom? As we rounded the corner by sticking to the camera blind spots, he explained that it was the only way to keep the both of us safe. Later I realized what he meant by that was Mercedes and Mother, and if I knew what he was doing, I would have strangled him. We met up with our mother in the parlor. The door was ajar, it was time to escape. The alluring moonlight of freedom shone into the mansion, and my spirits soared. As we tiptoed right by the door, to our horror we heard a voice we dreaded. It was that voice that haunted my dreams even to this day. The man that we called Father, a mockery of a man called Bartles, stood on the stairs waiting. He was clapping. Oh, the way his grin sickened me. I wanted to tear out his blackened heart and feed it to him. Laugh all you want, but all that vitriol in my heart had to go somewhere. He was everything that I hated in the world. Why could he not just let us be a family? I didn't want his money. I didn't want his beatings, or his warnings for stepping out of line carefully disguised as lectures. I just wanted a father. Was that so much to ask for? Mother tensed. She drew a knife, but Emil simply hugged onto her and told her to put it away. He would fix things. She relented only after seeing his innocent eyes, the kind that could melt even the coldest of hearts. And then he walked over to our father. I was furious. Why would he ever think of staying with that monster for a father? Did he not care about us? Had he betrayed us to him, coveting a piece of his wealth? My mind raced, struggling to understand why Emil, sweet little Emil, had run back to the very man we were trying to escape. He was my brother. How could he? And then I realized that he was trying to protect us. If Emil stayed, then there was no reason to chase after a mother past her prime and a mischievous daughter. It was a noble sacrifice and I was not willing to let him make it. Our father simply laughed a cold cackle, mocking us. He explained that Emil had made him a deal in exchange for being his heir. He would stay. He would let us go in exchange, free to live our lives as we pleased. And if Emil proved unsatisfactory, he would come for me. Not our mother, me. Mother begged and cried and asked for Emil, but he wouldn't budge. He just whispered for us to go. The man simply grabbed Emil by the hand, and I had never wanted to kill somebody more in my life. But I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen in place. I didn't deserve to escape, if it meant leaving Emil behind. I didn't deserve to be his sister. I was just another piece of gutter trash, as my father had once told me, ready to be used and disposed like my mother before me. It felt like an eternity before Mother yanked me away to where the car was waiting, as we sobbed and sobbed until my eyes were bloodshot. The car took us to a safe house that she had kept, but I didn't care. I just wanted my brother back. Was that too much for the goddess to grant? But she never answered my prayers, and so we had no choice but to pretend like nothing had ever happened. I tried to live my life. That was what Emil wanted, right? I went to school like a normal girl, and eventually got into Ferdinand University off of a scholarship. She was so proud we weren't rich by any standards, but we made do. Mother married for love, and this time it stuck. My new adoptive father was a strange man, but at least I didn't have to call him father. We were never particularly close, but I appreciated that he at least knew what not to talk about. Mother was never the same after Emil was left behind. She spent a lot of her time in the hospital from various illnesses. I learned so much about various diseases and their treatments, but it was as if she had given up. When she was diagnosed with terminal cancer, I knew it was the end. She kept cheering me on, even if her body was breaking down. I was afraid to even speak my brother's name, in fear that it would send her spiraling further into despair. In her name I continued my studies, not to follow my dream, but to help people who needed it most. My mother would have wanted that for me. She passed a few years ago, 1 year before I was supposed to graduate medical school. That was right before I met you. I didn't think much of you at first, you know. You were soaking wet, with all sorts of bruises and scrapes that healed oddly quickly. I had no idea who you were, except for your name. But from the look in your eyes alone, I knew that something terrible had happened to you. Maybe, I thought, the goddess had sent you to me for a reason. If I could not save my mother, then at least I could save you. I'd like to think that she was looking over us every time I took care of you. And all those years I searched for news of Emil and the rest of House Bartels. But there was nothing. Everything remotely relating to Bartels had been scrubbed off the internet, even his name had been taken off the company wall. No one knew who I spoke of. It was as if he was a ghost or that he had never existed at all. But the scar on my left arm is proof that he did, and I hope he's burning in hell for what he did to us. I hope he's dead or worse. He definitely deserves a lot worse. I kept searching. As the Saint of the Abyss, I was privy to information that others did not know. And because I dealt in favors, I could ask around without arousing too much suspicion. No one had ever heard of an Emil, but there were some mildly concerning rumors about a death knight floating around. One day, I poked my head too far into the magistrate's business. I was investigating an abandoned laboratory for some concoctions that Yuri told me about. I know. I should have asked you to come help. But I thought I could find something on Emil somewhere in their files. I never wanted you to be caught up in all this. You had your own problems to deal with, and you were just beginning as the Queen of Flames. I should have known better. I did find his name on one stray piece of paper. Emil, surname unknown, 60%. Uncontrollable bloodlust. Lost. I looked at that paper for what felt like hours. A single name and a number. I didn't understand what uncontrollable bloodlust really meant. And lost? It was only a scrap of the full document, but I clutched it so tightly it nearly tore. It was the only clue I had to find my brother. I prayed to the goddess that it would lead me to Emil, that I would find him safe and unharmed, and if that was not possible, that I could at least give him a proper burial. I didn't even notice who had arrived until I heard the Ashen Demon's voice behind me. You didn't tell me any of that before, Edelgard said, her eyes flashing with anger. You knew about the experiments. Nothing concrete. All they had were shredded scraps. The only thing I had to go off of was what you said about your imprisonment. I'm so sorry, Edelgard, she said wistfully, all I wanted was to find my brother. She sighed, slumping down in her chair as her anger deflated. I was on that list, she admitted after a pause. Which means he's another one of the magistrate's experiments. And the Ashen Demon? I don't know, she said softly. I never saw their face. Just a glowing mask in the darkness. Mercedes, you should be dead right now. Didn't they offer you mercy as well? Mercedes said, and a strange grin crept across her face. Maybe they spared us for a reason. Probably to toy with us, Edelgard muttered. They tore apart my men like they were ragdolls. But they didn't kill your men, did they? No. That doesn't change the fact that the Ashen Demon is perhaps the single most dangerous person in Newfoundland. We don't even know who they are, much less what they are truly capable of. But, Edelgard said, taking a breath. That doesn't matter for now. What did they tell you? They told me, well, they told me the Death Knight is the key, Mercedes. What? Her brow furrowed in confusion. They told you that. I didn't want to believe it at first. I thought that perhaps Emil had been taken by the Death Knight, that he was their prisoner or worse, another corpse in his collection. That was why I was so desperate to find out about who was under that mask. I told you spooky stories about the Reaper in Black, cutting his way through abyss, didn't I? She leaned back in her chair, a tear rolling down her cheek. I didn't think it could be him. Shit, Edelgard swore uncharacteristically. And now they have him. Mercedes blinked and looked at her, confused. When I was lying on the ground, unconscious, the Ashen Demon took the body of the Death Knight. Something about jurisdiction. Glenn wasn't very happy. Oh no, she whispered. That's why you made the deal with him, isn't it? Emil, her voice trailed off. I don't want you to get your hopes up. He might look like you, she warned, but you have no idea whether it's actually him. It could be a clone. Or an imposter. Or worse. Don't, Mercedes pleaded. Don't make it worse. All I want to know is that he's okay. I can't say for certain that it's him, Edelgard admitted. All we can do now is wait, and find out what the magistrate wants with the Death Knight. Maybe next time I cross blades with the Ashen Demon, I can figure that out for myself. I want to know if it's really him, she said quietly. If it's my little brother. Hey, she said, getting up out of her sofa to wrap Mercedes in a warm embrace. We'll find him. It'll be okay. She thought of her own brother, and how he had been helpless in their captivity with only her words to comfort him. Perhaps it was a mercy for Dima to be dead so that he would never suffer as much as she or Emil had. But at least there was a chance for Emil to be alive. She would never hear Dima's laughter again. For her sake, she hoped that Mercedes would find the happy ending she so wished for her brother. I'm so sorry, came a muffled apology, buried deep in Edelgard's dress. I know you've lost your family as well. You're my family, Edelgard whispered, planting a gentle kiss on her blonde hair. I promise to be here for you, just as you were for me. Until the very end. Once she figured out what Mercedes was going to do about Glenn, she bid a heartfelt farewell to her and began heading towards the rendezvous point where she would be meeting Ash and Monique. It was always bitter saying goodbye to the woman that had saved her life so many times, and she wondered if her friend would be alright. She was a saint, but that did not mean she was infallible. She just needed time to rest. All Edelgard could do was hope that it would be enough. The loss of a sibling was already bad for her mental state, but now she had to come to terms with the fact that her sweet little brother might be a merciless killer. And worse, he was now in the thralls of the magistrate and their Ashen Demon. Could she stop herself from killing the Death Knight, for Mercedes' sake? The streets widened, giving way to a small central square that once again hosted hundreds of people along with stalls that sold everything from aphrodisiacs to zodiac readings. She hurried through the crowd. No one thought much of the woman in a modest dress running through the throngs of people. There were a couple people that eyed her a bit more than she was comfortable with for once. She hoped that it was because they had taken an interest in her appearance rather than her identity. Ash and Monique should be here, she thought numbly, as the crowd passed her by. A larger man bumped into her, and she quickly muttered an apology before continuing to push through. Their tracker had gone offline in the tunnels, which she chalked up to the usual interference that Abyss had with tracking systems. Maybe if Ash was alone, then Edelgard could have chalked it up to getting lost. But he knew where he was going if he had once worked for Yuri, and then there was the question of his escort. Monique de la Rosa was an eccentric woman, but she was reliable to a fault. There was no way she would have gotten lost or been late, which meant that something nefarious was afoot. Edelgard forced her way out of the square and toward a side tunnel that was conveniently placed behind a building. This was the route she had designated for Ash to take, less of a public route than the main entrance to the surface, but still a bit of an open secret among mercenaries. She expected people to be walking in and out, but instead she found silence. Odd. Her grip tightened on the hollowks hidden beneath her dress. Moving into the tunnel, she walked for a few paces before she heard a shout. She didn't recognize it, but it was concerning nonetheless. Her hurried pace turned to a sprint, and she burst into the nearest intersection of tunnels just in time for a crossbow bolt came soaring toward her face. Instinctively she reached out with her hand and snatched it out of the air, taking advantage of her reflexes to do it in one smooth motion. Then she noticed that it was blinking rapidly, so she hurled it as far as she could before it exploded into a fiery ball. The bolt had come from a woman with dark hair that covered part of her eyes, wielding a crossbow in one hand and a dagger in the other. Her armor was completely black save for a few pieces of teal cloth that hung around her waist and arms. There were more daggers hanging on her belt, and she was reloading her crossbow to fire another salvo at Edelgard. She was accompanied by several men and women in black, each carrying daggers and swords of their own. They were gathering around the flaming remains of a motorcycle, as she strained her vision to see what was behind it. She realized that it was Ash and Monique, the latter having taken a dagger to the shoulder that left a scarlet stain blooming below her armor. Ash was carefully laying down suppressive fire with a crossbow of his own, peeking out from beneath the hollow shield he had deployed. It glowed a translucent red, but even she could see that it was beginning to be overwhelmed as cracks grew from where several shield-piercing bolts had struck. They were outnumbered 5-1, and that was including Edelgard coming to their rescue. It's an ambush, she realized with horror. And I've walked right into it. Chapter 34, and the Abyss stares back. I, Edelgard thought, am wearing a full suit of armor to Abyss from here on out. Linhard be damned. Time seemed to slow as she surged into the tunnel, dodging all sorts of projectiles as she careened toward the flaming carcass of a motorcycle. She whipped out her hollowks, letting it unfurl as her momentum carried her forward. A flurry of bolts whizzed past her left ear as she quickly dodged to the right before throwing herself at the first assailant. The lack of her hollow shield was glaringly obvious. She did not have the luxury of hiding behind a red screen of energy, nor could she afford to take a couple hits with her armor. The lady in black had switched to some sort of piercing ammunition. It would probably punch through her pretty easily, based on the gouges left in the tunnels. Crossbows were more versatile than antiquated firearms, especially since their lower speed meant that they could pass through shields with ease. But it also meant that they were easier to dodge, and for someone as augmented as Edelgard was, it meant that they were harmless unless she became distracted. The first soldier was completely covered from head to toe, sporting a black visor that suggested he was either an assassin for hire or part of one of the magistrate's wet work squads. They wielded a vibroblade that hummed menacingly in the darkened tunnel, which was almost immediately thrown at her chest. She swatted it away with her axe before the man drew another, this one larger and probably meant for actual hand-to-hand combat. The assassin jabbed at her chest, which she quickly parried with one of her axe's hollow blades before swerving to deliver a strike to his torso. He dodged out of the way and retaliated with a thrown dagger for her trouble. She managed to barely squeak under so that she could bring his legs out from under him with a low sweep. He tumbled down, giving her the window Edelgard needed to drive her axe into his chest. She felt his ribs crack as she pushed downward into his flesh. Edelgard barely had time to breathe before the next two came leaping toward her. These were not soldiers, they fought with the ferocity of hardened mercenaries and the precision of trained killers. She did not have the luxury of engaging them one at a time like she did with enforcers or even the Empire's legions. Daggers flashed in the air as she cut a red arc through the darkness with her axe. She noticed that some of them had an odd sheen to them, perhaps some sort of poison applied as a coating. She batted away a few stray strikes, as crossbow bolts flew toward her in quick barrages when she was least expecting it. She lived and breathed for combat, her breath steadied as her mind emptied. All she had to do was focus only on the fight and where her opponents were in relation to her. Every trick that Gustav had taught her, every technique that she had learned from her time dueling, every painful lesson behind each of her scars, they all came into play as she danced with her axe. A misstep here. A dagger extended too far there. All it took was a single mistake for Edelgard to punish her opponents, and soon there were 2 more dead bodies before her. She wrenched her axe free, letting the blood evaporate off of her blade and into the stale tunnel air. "Stay out of my way," the woman in command warned. "I'll deal with her myself." "But," Shamir another interjected, a non-combatant who was probably overseeing the whole operation. He was strangely dressed in a black tie and suit, and while Edelgard had no doubt it was armored underneath, he was far too overdressed for the occasion. "Secure the target," she finished, letting a final salvo loose at Edelgard before her crossbow clicked with a lack of ammunition. "I'll make it quick." It was at that moment that she realized that they were after Ash, not her. She noticed the broken body of one unlucky assassin who had been caught in the chest from a barrage of bolts, but there was another bearing down on his position. The Gaspard boy had quite the aim, his shots were carefully paced, without a hint of nervousness to it. He would make a fine addition to the Black Eagles if he lived, not to mention if he agreed to actually join. There was potential in his youth, and she wondered if he could beat Claude in a shooting contest with the right training. Monique was still moving, but she clutched her shoulder with her left arm and held her heated rapier in her sword arm. And she was struggling against an assassin who held 2 swords in each of their hands. Considering Monique was already at a disadvantage, it was probably not ending well for her. Without Edelgard there, they would be overrun in less than a minute. They were only about 100 feet away, but it felt like miles as she ran. The intersection was a 4-way, the way she had come from led to Abyss, while the opposite side was the main road that Ash and plenty of other mercs used. The other 2 led to tunnel networks that were only mapped for navigation. She had no idea what else hid in those tunnels. Somebody must have spotted the Gaspard boy and a Black Eagle going down those tunnels, or worse, her plans had been leaked beforehand. The woman Shamir was apparently her name decided to take matters into her own hands and engage Edelgard directly. She batted away a few thrown daggers, cursing as they nicked her left arm. Where they struck, a searing sensation began to course through her arm, but her augmentations would hopefully protect against the worst of the poison's side effects. All she could do was grit her teeth and finish off her assailant as quickly as possible. The first move was Edelgard's. She swung her axe in a wide motion, forcing Shamir backwards but also giving her the opportunity to slip in for a strike. She held 2 vibra-blades in both hands, and began to strike where Edelgard's guard was down. The first stab barely missed her torso as she dodged to the left, and the second clipped the edge of her axe and went skittering to the floor. Unfazed, she pressed onward and began a second swing. But instead of backing away, Shamir quickly kicked her in the shin and kneed her in the chest before she could bring her axe around. Edelgard stumbled a bit, but she was not as strong as the Death Knight or Thunder Catherine. It took only a moment for her to recover and retaliate with an outstretched fist, which Shamir could not dodge in time. It caught her in the forearm as she shouted in pain. The axe came around once more, and Shamir quickly vanished in a cloud of smoke that she had somehow activated. Without her visor, she could not see through the assassin's trickery, leaving her wide open for an attack. Still, Shamir was only human. And she could only move as fast as a human could, no matter how skilled she was at her craft. Edelgard's eyes flickered around for any trace movement, before spotting a flash of green coming at her from behind. She instinctively reached out her hand and found an assassin's blade coming right at her. But this time she caught the dagger, and though it left a searing gash in her palm, she managed to press onwards and swirl her axe in a large motion to dissipate some of the smoke. Shamir had retreated to a safe distance, and was now moving toward Ash and Monique. "Hey!" Ash shouted. "Need a little help here?" She broke out into a sprint once more, trying to intercept Shamir before she could finish off her targets and escape. 3 assassins moved to stop her in a careful formation, but she leapt with all her strength, soaring over their heads and nearly hitting her head on the top of the tunnel. She landed on the tunnel floor hard enough to crack the concrete, which also had the unfortunate side effect of damaging her boots with a small crunch. Damn it, she thought absent-mindedly. I liked those shoes. In a matter of seconds, she managed to make her way over to the motorcycle and the barricade that Ash was using for cover. Shamir was still trading bolts with Ash, though she was understandably nervous about approaching further. These guys are serious, he muttered as he finally ran out of bolts for his wrist crossbow and drew his sword. And they really want me? I can see that quite clearly, she remarked with a hint of snarkiness. Monique, can you fight? Somehow she had managed to outduel the assassin despite her injuries, who was now lying on the ground with a broken rapier embedded in his skull. Blood dripped from his wound through his broken mask into a pool of crimson, and she almost felt bad for him. I need a new sword, she said numbly. Her face was strained, which meant that the poison was probably taking its toll. Edelgard might have been relatively unaffected save for a strange tingling sensation in her hand and arm, but her subordinates were definitely not. She needed immediate medical attention, but only if they made it out of here alive. Next one's on me. Ash, cover my flank, Edelgard declared, holding up her axe with the deployed hollow shield to the left. We'll hold them off until help arrives. Help. His eyes flickered around, as the assassins were regrouping without the threat of Ash's deadly aim to pin them down. How do we call for help? There's no signal here. With any luck, someone will pass through here. I don't like the sound of that. He blocked a strike from an assassin with his energy blade, before retaliating with a series of classic fencing moves that forced them backwards. Ash was an archer at heart, though his technique was good. He lacked the killer instinct that many of her swordsmen had. He didn't take risks, which meant that he would probably be at a stalemate for quite a while. Edelgard decided to press the offensive. The first attacker on her side moved toward her in a clever zigzag motion, forcing her to use wide sweeps to catch any potential attack they committed to. This proved to be in her favor. She managed to catch the woman off guard by using the shaft of her axe, knocking her downwards with a solid impact to the head. Once again, she finished her off with a blade to the chest for her trouble. The commander Shamir was probably calling for reinforcements as her head was angrily bobbing up and down in front of her wrist. The non-combatant was simply assessing the situation, but she noticed that he was fidgeting with his belt. Some sort of activation device? She had no idea why they were trying to kill Ash. Or were they trying to capture him? That made more sense, considering they could have just put a few bolts in his skull from downrange. Maybe she could buy some time if she tried asking, she thought, and if asking wasn't enough, then she would get the answers by force. You've bitten off more than you can chew, Edelgard taunted from a fair distance away. Do you really think you can win anymore? I don't plan on winning this time, Shamir said, looking away from her wrist and straight through the red of the hollow shield towards Edelgard. But the next time, I will succeed. Who sent you? She growled. Basic OPSEC, she said curtly. An assassin never reveals their contractor. Whatever they're paying you, it cannot be enough for this, Edelgard retorted. She sighed. No. It most certainly is not. But I have a job to carry out, and I never fail. Too late. You have already failed, said a familiar synthesized voice from the darkness behind Shamir, and Edelgard's heart skipped a beat in response. She heard the familiar footsteps of heavy boots, as the Ashen Demon walked out of one of the tunnels and straight toward Shamir. She noticed that there were similarities between their armor and the assassins, though they lacked the elegance of the Ashen Demon's armor platings along with the visible cybernetics on their torso. This time, a turquoise fabric covered their head and shoulders, shrouding a black mask that glowed blue in a strange pattern. It seemed they had received some upgrades since the two of them had last met. Shit, the other woman swore. When I said I needed backup, this was not what I meant, she said, glaring angrily at the approaching figure. Shamir Neverend. You will bring what men you have left back to base for a debriefing. Yeah, she retorted. And why would I do that when you're probably going to decommission me after? It is not in our best interests to kill our most useful assets, the voice of the Ashen Demon responded back. Your failure is insignificant. Your soldiers were weak, you were not. Humph. Awfully chatty today, aren't you, demon, she grumbled. Fine. Have your fun, then. She motioned for her men to follow where the Ashen Demon had come from, which left only about 5 people scrambling toward her as she moved into a quick jog. None of them protested seeing the bodies on the floor, they were more than happy to take their leave and wash their hands clean of the debacle. She headed toward the tunnels further away from Abyss District, which was a little more than mildly concerning. The magistrate didn't use the Abyss for fear of mercenary ambushes had they somehow figured out a way to navigate the entire thing. And the woman was awfully nonchalant about the Ashen Demon's appearance, a sentiment that Edelgard did not share. The Ashen Demon simply stood where Shamir had been, watching the wreckage whose flames had long since sputtered out with quiet interest. Edelgard stood at the side of the hollow shield, while Ash was tending to Monique's wound. She moaned in pain, as he bandaged her wound with part of his undershirt that he had cut off. He flashed Edelgard a look of confusion, which she simply responded with a shake of her head. If she failed now, then all 3 of them were dead or worse, captured and tortured for every last bit of information in their brains. It was better if they escaped for now. My bike's in stealth here, she gestured, reaching for Ash's hand and tapping her holodeck to his to transmit the location. Get Monique to safety and call for help. Use the route here. But what about you, Dash? He paused, looking at Monique shivering underneath the bandages as the poison worked its way through her veins. Shit, I don't have a choice, do I? He whispered in horror. Ash looked up at the strange figure watching them carefully, his face pale with apprehension. He knew that if they stayed Monique was as good as dead, and Edelgard staying would at least distract the demon for a good while. He carefully leaned over to give Monique his shoulder, who took it with her left arm as they began limping towards the opposite direction of the Ashen Demon and in the opposite direction of where Shamir and her assassins had gone. They were painfully slow, and she wondered if she was sending them to their deaths. It wouldn't be the first few lives she had thrown away on a failed gambit, but a gambit was better than guaranteed death at the hands of the demon. Queen of Flames, the voice intoned, catching her attention so that she looked away from the fading form of Ash and Monique and toward the demon. Ashen Demon, Edelgard greeted mockingly. Come to kill me? Yes. Kill her without hesitation, the voice purred. It was odd how they phrased that, but she pushed it to the side as she had a fight to win. You can try, Edelgard replied coldly, despite the way her last fight with her opponent had ended. She switched her stance to holding her axe with both hands, and began to approach the Ashen Demon at a steady pace, freeing her mind of any thought other than the fight before her. Even though the open wound on her hand still smarted, it was beginning to scab, and whatever poison had been put on her was wearing off quickly. She could win, but only if she fought carefully. The mask remained silent, passive and unmoving, standing still as a statue. As Edelgard strutted toward her opponent, they drew their energy blade from their belt, glowing an eerie light blue, reflecting off their gleaming armor. She didn't have time for this. Every moment she left Monique and Ash to fend for themselves presented another opportunity for the assassin Shamir to return. But if the Ashen Demon did have the answers she so desperately searched for, then perhaps this was her chance. She just had to live long enough to find out. With a valiant cry, she surged forward and swung with her axe toward the Ashen Demon. They only used a single hand to swing their blade up and block, and the flurry of attacks that Edelgard unleashed was still not enough. They had impeccable defense, and any opening that Edelgard left was quickly prompted by a swift sword stab that she was forced to dodge. Still, she only had to land a single strike, and as she feinted left and swung down, the Ashen Demon once again blocked with their blade. But this time, she pushed even harder, forcing them backwards and locking their blades together. You cannot win, said the Ashen Demon. You're stronger this time, but you're just as predictable. I don't care, she spat, pushing even harder. I've fought better. Ah, Thunder Catherine. Or perhaps the Death Knight. No matter. The Ashen Demon seems to be faltering today, perhaps we can change that. She heard a click of disapproval, as her opponent surged forward, keeping her on the back foot. Edelgard struggled to keep up, and she was beginning to lose the battle of strength as she was forced back, giving up a few inches as her boots lost traction. "And what have you done with the Death Knight?" she shouted, managing to regain a foothold as she adjusted her stance. "That is none of your concern. But he is where he belongs." The reply was as monotone as ever, and she noticed that their voice did not seem strained at all, unlike hers. She knew the demon was strong, but this was another level entirely, considering they were holding Edelgard back with one hand. "You're toying with me," she shouted, forcing the blade back and the wielder along with it. She brought her axe to her side and stared down her enemy. "You think this is a joke?" She heard a hiss from their throat, which was quickly finished off by a shake of the ashen demon's head, the first gesture that suggested they were even human. Their restraint only served to infuriate Edelgard more. She surged forward, trying to catch the ashen demon off guard with a series of wide-sweeping attacks. They didn't take the bait, and instead blocked each one calmly with precise flourishes. The ashen demon drew first blood. They managed to catch Edelgard off balance with a stray swipe, cutting into the side of her dress and leaving a tiny gash on the side of her stomach. It didn't do much damage, but the sentiment that she was fighting a losing battle was clear to both of them. Edelgard grimaced, and retaliated with a slam of her axe shaft onto their armor. This didn't have much effect, since the ashen demon simply vaulted backwards and stood on 2 feet once more. Edelgard was panting with effort, and clutching her weapon in her shaking hands, while the ashen demon simply stood there with their energy blade at their side. It almost seemed as if they were confused, unsure of how to proceed. "Who are you?" she shouted. "What has the magistrate done to you?" "We have done nothing." "Then you are as brainwashed as the rest," she muttered, mustering the rest of her courage to ready her axe once more. "The ashen demon cannot be allowed to live. You will die here, forgotten." Her opponent leveled their blade at Edelgard, shimmering menacingly with glowing light. But it was shaky, and she wondered if the demon was faltering because they were tiring or because there was something keeping them from advancing. "Do not waste your time on errant thoughts, demon. Finish her off." Edelgard charged forward with her axe, carving an arc of red through the air toward her opponent. The ashen demon said nothing in reply and just blocked her initial blow, their movements as brutally efficient as any mercenary and as graceful as a world-class fencer. It was difficult to land any hit, and whatever got past their guard was blocked by a pair of gauntlets that her axe merely glanced off of. Their strikes were far too quick and unpredictable to be parried properly, so she was relying on her own reflexes to dodge out of the way in time. For the most part, it worked, though she caught a few scrapes in the process. All she had to do was figure out the demon's weakness, if they had any at all. Finally she saw an opening in their impeccable defense as they swung too far forward with their blade, and she used it to feint a downward swing before driving her axe towards the ashen demon's breastplate. But instead it merely left a gash across their chest, though it was impossible to see if it had actually cut through flesh or not. She barely had time to pull back before a flash of blue sliced through where she was standing just a moment ago. The ashen demon looked down at their chest for a second, backing up out of reach. But aside from that, there was no real reaction. Not even a cry of pain. Just confusion, radiating out from underneath the mask. "What are you doing?" the voice shouted, referring to the ashen demon. Why were they referring to themselves in third person? Unless... They looked downward at their wound, back at Edelgard, and then continued to hold their gaze. Blue light shone from underneath their helmet in the shape of rudimentary eyes, boring into the thin layer of light that hid her true identity from the world. As the voice hissed their vocal disapproval, they put a hand to the side of their neck and pressed a button Edelgard had not known even existed. The voice sputtered out and became silent, before the demon did something Edelgard was not expecting. They spoke. Not through a synthesizer, but with their real voice, or what presumably was a real voice, considering it came from their throat and not a voice box. Strange. "Why do I stay my blade?" The demon's voice had a slight feminine edge to it, though it was monotone and emotionless. But Edelgard could not tell if it was merely the way their voice echoed through their mask that made them so detached from reality. There was a slight metallic tone to it, as if their vocal cords had been ripped out and replaced with steel. She preferred it to the synthetic voice that made the demon seem robotic in nature. This was almost human. Something about it made Edelgard's heart skip a beat. Edelgard wanted to say something in response, but her voice caught in her throat. She had that feeling of nagging familiarity when she recalled something from her false memories, but now it was twisted with dread and horror. A mixture of emotions crept through her brain, unsure of what to make of the Ashen Demon. What were they? You, their voice wavered, growing quieter. You made me remember something. A woman who wished for a world without crests. Somehow those words seemed awfully familiar, but without any memories flooding to her brain she could not do anything with that information. She would just let the Ashen Demon speak for the moment and then kill her afterward. After all, she was buying time in the hopes that Ash could get help, and that was assuming he couldn't be killed in the tunnels. You're holding back, Edelgard pointed out. The Ashen Demon doesn't hold back. They're planning something. No. I do not, they glared at their glowing blade, twisting it in a strange movement. Tell me, Queen of Flames. What do you fight for? An odd question coming from someone who supposedly slaughtered indiscriminately, but she supposed there was more to the Ashen Demon than just their reputation of being a terrifying assassin. But it was one with an easy answer. I fight against you, Edelgard decided, spitting out the words with as much vitriol as she could. I fight against the God Emperor and everything that he stands for. She did not care to explain about how she wanted revenge against Thales for what he had done, for the God Emperor to answer for his negligence and warmongering, and how the magistrate was corrupt down to the last secretary. That level of nuance would probably be wasted, and it wasn't as if anybody wanted to hear her rambling. The demon paused. I see. So that is the future you have chosen. Out of all 566, they raised their blade back into a one-handed stance, twirling it around. Then we are at an impasse. You fight against the Empire, as I fight to preserve it. Preserve? The Empire is rotting from the inside out from corruption and strife. The only solution is to tear it all down and rebuild it anew, and you are blind if you cannot see that. I am not so deluded as to believe it is a utopia, the Ashen Demon said simply. But you will see in due time that your cause is hopeless. The alternative of anarchy is untenable. Hopeless or not, she retorted, it beats living under oppression, in an empire that throws away the lives of its subjects. Tell me, demon, has the God Emperor ever cared for anybody except for himself? Her hands slightly shook with anger at the fact that she was being reminded of her own futility. There was a part of Edelgard that admitted there might have been some truth to that statement. Had she done any meaningful damage to the God Emperor and his empire yet? Could she actually rally the people to action, while they enjoyed the frivolous lives the God Emperor granted them at the cost of those beneath? It was a question that even she could not answer. But her response would never change no matter how hopeless it was. Even if she was the only one left, she would continue to fight. The God Emperor's will is absolute. Through his will he creates a world of order from chaos, and through his demon he enforces his will. That is why I am the Ashen Demon, said her opponent, and I must do my duty in spite of these strange feelings. They spat out the last word as if it were a curse. Edelgard gritted her teeth in anticipation of the fight resuming. If you are so loyal to your God Emperor, she spat, then try to remove me. I believe you are more valuable to us alive than dead, the Ashen Demon declared. Though Thales would disagree on that. You're naive if you think you can use me. No. I merely have many questions for you to answer. And I will do whatever it takes to save her. Her. Her confusion gave way to surprise as the Ashen Demon dashed forward inhumanly fast, and Edelgard barely managed to catch the strike with her axe. This was the demon on the offensive superhumanly fast, with lethal attacks that threatened to lop off Edelgard's head if she was not careful. They were a black blur in the already dark intersection, leaving small streaks of blue energy dancing around in the darkness. Edelgard struggled to keep up with the onslaught, and she realized that she was utterly outclassed. But even though she did not have the Ashen Demon's skill, she at least had unpredictability. So when the next swing came and she barely blocked it with the handle of her axe, she instead leaned in and smacked her head as hard as she could into the Ashen Demon's faceplate. She heard something crack, but there was barely even a reaction from them. Just a low growl filtered through the mask, and a retaliatory stab that threatened to skewer her. Blue and red danced through the tunnel's darkness, sparks arcing through the air as their blades crashed. The Ashen Demon's energy blade still kept its integrity despite repeated strikes with her full strength, and no matter how much she fought, she knew that her hallux would fail eventually. Time slowed to a crawl as Edelgard took a step back and blocked, only for the Ashen Demon to press the offensive and push her closer and closer to one of the tunnel walls. She vaulted backward over the motorcycle wreckage and the hollow shield behind it, only for a blade to slice through. With one swing they cleaved the glowing wall of red in two, causing it to fizzle out of existence. She was running out of space. Sooner or later she would have to flee into the tunnel behind her, or face being cut down unceremoniously. Edelgard dodged a feint and brought her axe up in time to block a wide sweeping blow, but she was beginning to tire. Sweat dripped down her forehead as she pushed herself further, while the Ashen Demon continued their onslaught in a frenzy of attacks. There were no identifiable patterns or ticks she could pick up on whatever the Ashen Demon was, they were barely human. With one final swing, she managed to land a blow on one of their vambraces hard enough to push them backwards, but in doing so Edelgard felt the searing pain of energy pushing through her flesh. The Ashen Demon's sword left a jagged gash in her right shoulder, slicing through the thin red fabric nearly down to the bone. Only her quick reaction saved her entire right arm from being severed, and she nearly dropped her axe in pain. She leapt backwards, sweeping her axe out in a blind attempt to clear some distance between her and her opponent. The figure ahead of her just tilted their head, as if studying her. Then they rushed in for the kill with their sword raised, causing Edelgard to flinch in response. Her life couldn't end here. Not before she had her vengeance. If fate was on her side, then she would live. The Ashen Demon stopped in the middle of their attack as a massive floodlight shone onto both of them, cutting through the darkness and causing her to instinctively flinch. "There they are," a familiar voice shouted, and she knew that it could be no other than Ash. A truck burst out into the tunnel, swerving to reveal its left side as a small group of mercenaries poured out with weapons raised. She had never been so glad to see an unidentified band of soldiers pour out in her life, and with a glance, it soon became clear who was leading them. They all had small purple accents on their armor and the symbol of a bird etched into their pauldrons. And leading them was a man with lavender hair and a strange androgynous beauty about him, dressed to the nines with the armor of an assassin. "Yuri Leclerc." "Ashen Demon," he shouted. Supporting him were his mercenaries armed to the teeth, but there was also the matter of the truck. In the rear was a massive floodlight along with a rudimentary plasma cannon on top of it. It must have been an old magistrate model, repaired to serve as the Mockingbird's insurance in case he went up against something he couldn't handle. Turning to face the new threat, the Ashen Demon simply stood there and lowered their sword. It was a standoff. The mercenaries were beginning to surround the two of them, Yuri leading the way with his daggers raised. He was barking out orders, and soon they began to blur together as Edelgard's consciousness began to waver from the pain. She was panting, clutching her right shoulder and trying her best to stay upright. Strangely, the Ashen Demon did not move to attack or even flee, despite the looming threat behind them. They instead turned back around to face Edelgard and spoke. "It seems that my time is up. I was unable to do what was necessary." "Wait!" Edelgard shouted, still holding her bleeding shoulder. "Do you wish to die here, along with the rest of them?" "No. I don't." Edelgard's voice caught in her throat as she struggled to keep her emotions in check. "Why?" she asked desperately. "Why spare me of all people?" "I wish to find out why," the voice said, and there was a hint of sorrow underneath. "Perhaps one future will prove successful. Enjoy your brief reprieve, Queen of Flames. I will not be so lenient next time." Edelgard's mind throbbed, as she desperately tried to make sense of the demon's words. They, too, searched for an answer that eluded them, and she dimly wondered if the Ashen Demon had the same false memories plaguing her own life. And one future, did that mean there were multiple in store? There was a part of her that was drawn to the demon, and despite the burning injuries in her hand and shoulder, for some reason she did not want her opponent to leave. The mercy she was granted could no longer be dismissed as pity or coincidence. There was something the Ashen Demon wanted from her. The Queen of Flames was the one who would supposedly tear down the Empire, but before the sword of the demon who stalked the night, she was powerless to resist. They pressed the same button right above their neck, which resulted in a static sound and a screeching voice that quickly faded into silence. As Yuri's men scrambled forward to surround the Ashen Demon, they simply smashed a smoke capsule on the ground. Thick, black smoke filled the air as both the mercenaries and the Ashen Demon disappeared. A single breath was enough for her to double over and cough for a good minute before it dissipated. And by the time she regained her senses, Yuri was helping her up with no Ashen Demon in sight. "Are you all right?" he asked. His face was furrowed with concern, as he supported Edelgard with a gentle hand supporting her right arm. There was a moment of silence between the two of them, before she broke it by coughing up blood. She spit it out onto the ground while Yuri kept his distance, waiting for a response. "I'll live," she said numbly, glaring at the tunnel floor. The words for now remained unspoken, lingering upon her lips as Yuri tended to her wounds the best he could. How could her rebellion succeed if she could not even defeat a single demon? "So, you were ambushed?" "On your way to meet me," Yuri drawled. "Curious." He raised an inquisitive eyebrow as he lounged back in his reclining chair, expecting an answer from Ash and Edelgard, who were sitting on the sofa across from him in his office. He had done a bit of renovation since the last time she was here, probably as a direct result the property damage she had caused. The place was as understated as ever, but there was a certain bit of elegance to the perfectly cleaned dressers and filing cabinets, with the vibe of an old-school office. "For the last time, yes," Edelgard groaned. "Why is this so suspicious?" Monique and Edelgard had been taken to Mercedes's to be treated for their wounds. For the former, she received a healthy amount of the antidote along with regular checkups on the hour to make sure blood coagulation didn't kill her. With any luck, she'd be out in a few hours, a healthy amount of time for the Queen of Flames to get her business done before Leclerc's closed for the night. The latter, however, received a stern scolding from the Saint of the Abyss when she arrived. But Mercedes's indignance was softened by the news she received about the Ashen Demon, that they really had taken the Death Knight, and that until she met them again there was no telling if it was really her brother or not. She had hoped to let their meeting sit a little, but there was no telling what the future had in store. Not with the Ashen Demon running around, who knew things beyond her comprehension. It was infuriating knowing that she had no agency in the face of something greater almost as much as the God Emperor angered her. It's suspicious because it's quite careless for someone who's trying to lead a rebellion. "You're lucky that Ash got here in time," he admonished. "I fail to see how I could have foreseen multiple assassins attacking Lonato's son, not to mention the fact that they shouldn't even have known about it." She tried to keep her anger in check, but Yuri's smug expression was definitely not helping. "Well, they did," Yuri said bluntly. "Either they took a blind shot in the dark or they knew where Ash was, and though this time you got lucky, the next time you might not be. There's nothing lucky about running into the Ashen Demon." "No, there isn't," he said, trailing off. "Why make an appearance now of all things, the legendary demon of the night, attacking the Queen of Flames in the tunnel? She almost had you too. Did not?" Yuri rolled his eyes. "So you were." "Yuri," Ash said, breaking the tension between them. "You know, you could help her." "I beg your pardon, Hubert." "Gaspard," he warned, a hint of anger seeping out from beneath his gaze. "It's Gaspard now." "Sorry. Old habits die hard, I guess," Yuri said nonchalantly, and Ash seemed to relax a little. "How exactly do you want me to help?" "I know what your spies are capable of. If you guys coordinate, then there'd be less blind spots for the Queen of Flames. Maybe someone would have gotten lucky and spotted the ambush." Ash was naive as ever it seemed, but a healthy dose of optimism might have been what she needed after being so glum. She had been thoroughly humbled once again by the Ashen Demon, and now both her pride and her brain hurt. "You mean what you were capable of, once," he reminded the Gaspard heir. He turned to explain to Edelgard. "Ash was a part-time courier for me. Back when he lived in Abyss, eating rats and raising 2 siblings by himself, and he was quite the little rascal." She internally chuckled at that. The honest, naive boy in front of her being mischievous? Impossible. "I never got to thank you properly," he muttered, his face flushed. "Without you, I'd never have broken into Lonato's home, and he'd never have taken us in. Maybe he'd still be Dash." With a visibly glum face, he uncharacteristically slumped further down into the sofa next to Edelgard. He didn't have to finish his statement to make himself clear. Perhaps there was a part of him that blamed himself for Lonato's failed rebellion, and now it was coming to the surface. But now she understood a little more about him. Yuri had employed him as a boy, only to be adopted by Governor Lonato in a strange twist of fate. "I'm sorry, by the way, for your loss," Yuri said with a set expression. He looked genuinely remorseful, not that he had done anything, but it certainly helped to convey his message. Lonato was a good man. People keep saying that, he muttered angrily. Do they think that's going to make me feel better? It's not about feeling better, Yuri said simply. It's about honoring Lonato's death. It doesn't have to make you feel better, that's for you to decide. That's the most we can do for him, right? Honor him. Ash didn't reply, still taking an interest in the carpet on the floor that separated him and Yuri. Edelgard cleared her throat to interrupt the two of them. I hate to interrupt a nice reunion, but I came here today to speak to you. And Balthus, if he's here. Oh, he's here, Yuri grinned. And he's just dying to see you. Balthus. His voice carried through the locked door and down the stairs, and soon she heard a set of thundering footsteps run up the steps from the bar below. Then there was a knock in a strange pattern Morse code, maybe? Yuri got up from his chair and opened it, revealing a massive man whose flippant expression turned into a scowl when he saw Edelgard. Like always, he was dressed in a cheap suit that threatened to burst at the seams if he ever so much as flexed his muscles. It would have looked professional had he buttoned the top of his shirt and worn a tie. This was done to expose his pectorals, a fact that did not elude Edelgard as she caught a glimpse and immediately regretted it. Everything closed down for the night? Yuri asked his bouncer. You bet. I just got the call. I'm surprised you wanted me in on an off day. What do ya want me here for? I specifically requested you be here, Balthus, Edelgard cut in. You need to listen to this. Oh, it's the Queen. Well, if you're here to choke out Yuri again, the King of Grappling is here to stop you. Enough, B, Yuri said, holding up a hand as Balthus relaxed. That was a one-time thing. Ash fidgeted at that. Queen of Flames. Care to elaborate on what you called us here for? She sucked in a deep breath for dramatic effect. Happy. Edelgard stated as calmly as she could as she recalled the fiasco underneath Mount Gaspard. Coco. Those names mean anything to you? At that, Yuri froze, his expression hardening. It was at that moment that the facade of Yuri the bartender fell, revealing the mockingbird in his true colors. The way he carried himself, with a no-nonsense attitude and the slimy feeling that he would cut your throat if you looked away even from a single glance. She knew she would have to choose her words carefully. It was serious if he wasn't flirting, and Edelgard had made it plainly clear that she was quite serious about the whole thing as well. Balthus was just as surprised, throwing his hands up in an exaggerated expression of confusion. What? Do I need to repeat myself? Explain. Yuri's gaze was hard as flint, boring into Edelgard with the intensity of twin suns. Now. Do you want the short version or the long version? Short version, Balthus quipped, but Yuri silenced him with a glare. Everything. Start from the beginning. She took a deep breath, and began her story. All this time, they were right underneath my nose, Yuri muttered. Fuck. Then he slammed his fist onto his desk in a rare display of anger, hard enough to crack the very expensive wood underneath. Balthus backed up in surprise, and Ash flinched. Edelgard just sat there, waiting for Yuri to regain his composure as he wringed out his right hand. Boss. Balthus asked carefully. I'm fine, Yuri snarled. I looked for them for years. I thought the shady lady and Happy eloped when I couldn't get in touch with them, but after a year I started to get concerned. They left little breadcrumbs behind, but it wasn't enough. Every time I thought I found them, their location was moved. I was always one step behind them. And they were right there. So that's why you were investigating the Remeyer laboratory, Edelgard deduced. Yes. I was apparently a few months too late, he said, leaning his recliner back and then pushing forward once again in a strangely childish outburst with his legs hanging just barely off the floor. Goddess, I was an idiot. You couldn't have known. I should have investigated more, Balthus muttered. Or beat the answers out of those scientists one by one. Balthus, you couldn't investigate your way out of a paper bag. If you did it your way, we'd have a bunch of fresh bodies to bury and no leads whatsoever. Yuri buried his face in the palms of his hands. And yet you guys, of all people, found them by chance. They were the family you talked about, right? Ash said. Back when I was working for you. You said that you were part of a pack. I was being intentionally vague and cheeky, but yes. We were the Ashen Wolves for a while, he said quietly. A bunch of outcasts, who never fit in anywhere. Constance was a disgraced noblewoman. Happy found her way here after her village was annihilated, and we still have no idea why. Balthus dash. Yeah, Balthus was too handsome for the magistrate, so they put his face on every wanted poster in Newfoundland. He glared at Edelgard. I suppose now they have your helmet on it, don't they? And you? Edelgard asked, pointedly ignoring the bouncer. What did that make you? I was a boy who never learned to hold his tongue, Yuri said. It might have bit me in the ass when I was younger, but I wouldn't be lord of the underworld if I didn't have a sharp wit. He was a retainer for House Row, he whispered. Oh, she whispered back, and Yuri's eyes narrowed. Ash, he warned. Sorry, Yuri. He sighed. Whatever. Yuri. We're allies, Edelgard reminded sternly. You don't need to be paranoid about your past. He laughed bitterly. You're one to talk, when you don't even show your face. We're allies. Not friends. Not confidants. Just working for the same cause. I came to you about this, didn't I? Have some faith in me, at least. And Ash. Ash I trust, he said wryly. The boy's a terrible liar. I am not Dash, he protested. Exactly, Yuri grinned impishly. But you, Queen of Flames, not so much. It's true that I've benefited tremendously from the information we share, and so have you. But it's hard to really trust someone when you've never seen their face, right? In due time, Mockingbird. It's not out of the question. But give it time. I thought you would say that, he said, slumping backwards. Isn't she so interesting? Just about the most interesting thing that's happened to Leclerc's in the last few years or so. She flushed, which now that she no longer had a full mask on was quite visible to everyone. Well, what about the Shay incident? Balthus asked. Oh, we don't talk about that, Yuri growled, and his face darkened with rage. Well, if it means I can fight the legendary Queen of Flames, then I'm happy to see her here. Just so long as she doesn't try to choke you out again. She really tried to choke Yuri out. Ash said dimly. Yes, no, that's not the point, Yuri groaned, face-palming. But yes. I understand that our alliance has been very transactional and I get it. You've given me your trust by coming to me about this and I can thank you in information or money. But I'd rather have the Queen of Flames working with me than against me, and to me that's more valuable than anything else. What do you say about that? I can't say I like the idea of being ferreted out and spied on by the savage Mockingbird's spy network, Edelgard replied wryly. I don't mind working with you, Leclerc. Well, then. Will you join our little rebellion? Officially Dash, he paused for a second. No. I'm a bartender and owner. I don't have political affiliations, and neither does Leclerc's. But unofficially. Unofficially, yes. I'll keep my ear out for you, Yuri said with a sly smile. You have my word and my support. If anyone asks, birds of a feather flock together, the mockingbird and the eagles, working side by side. And if anybody wants to fight against the magistrate, I'll send them your way. I thought that'd be your answer, Edelgard said smugly. You'd never let an opportunity like this slip you by. Yuri had already helped her enough with gathering information, but she knew that even he had his secrets. If he could simply get access to the records he had, along with his spy network, then she was well on her way to toppling the magistrate. Information, not soldiers, was often what won wars, and it was going to provide her the crucial edge she needed in her little rebellion. And if she could spare the pain of emptying out her coffers for Yuri's services, then even better. Of course, in exchange, you're going to come with us. Come where? She asked with mock confusion. Back to Mount Gaspard, of course, Yuri explained. Now that you've explained the situation, I'm going to assemble a team. You think I'm going to leave Happy and Coco rotting down there? Hell no. As far as I'm concerned, I would march through the flames of Alel to see them. That they're even alive and kicking is a bonus. You may not like what you find, Edelgard warned, but fine. She remembered the madness that had taken hold of Constance, along with Happy to a lesser extent. She recalled her fear that she, too, might one day be stricken by insanity. Would Edelgard have to be put down before she did anything too rash? How bad can it be? Balthus said. And for the umpteenth time today, Yuri flashed him a look that said shut up. His eyes narrowed, looking at Edelgard. I know I want to save my friends. But I suppose you want the information in that laboratory, Yuri surmised. Yes. But I also hate to see those two suffering, she said. Not when Happy did so much to get us out, despite being pretty much powerless. Happy, despite her prickly exterior, always was a kind soul, Yuri recalled. She loved animals, the scary kinds, the ones that people usually freaked about. You know, she once owned a giant snake. The python named Albert. Balthus asked. Albus, Yuri hissed. She named it after you. Well, it's a snake. It shouldn't have to have a name. Forget I mentioned it. It was my fault they left in the first place, anyway. I thought they deserved better than being in Abyss, Yuri said sadly. So I pulled some strings and got them an interview in Fhirdiad, and before they knew it, they were both in the university. I didn't want to break up the Ashen Wolves, you know? But I had to. It was better if we went our own ways and found success in life, rather than clinging to mediocrity in an underground hellhole. But then why'd you stay? Edelgard asked, thoroughly intrigued. Because the Abyss is my home now, Yuri said bitterly. I realized that I could help the people here, as much as it had helped me. And boy, it definitely hurt me more than it helped at first. But if fate brought me here in the first place, then it was also fated that I would stay. Balthus stayed because he's an idiot. Someone has to keep you from running into danger and dying. You mean you wanted to run from every bounty hunter who ever lived, and also so that the magistrate doesn't take you to collections for your outstanding debts. Of which you have many, he added. 2 birds with 1 stone. You guys saved me, Ash recalled. And my brother and sister. Without you, I'd be just another starving orphan. I wouldn't even be alive today. I did, and I'm glad, Yuri said wistfully. You were a good kid, Ash. I'm glad you're still kicking. Somehow. Ash protested, but Edelgard smiled slightly. Yuri, for all his talk of being the lord of the underworld, had a heart of gold underneath. He was actually quite similar to Mercedes in that sense. They both gave up their surface ambitions to save others, though for Yuri, being the leader of a spy network and a fixer for half the mercenary bands wasn't really that bad of a gig after all. And though she still did not know much about his earlier life or about his time with the Ashen Wolves, bits and pieces were beginning to fall into place. And although Yuri was every bit as manipulative and shrewd as she was, his compassion was something that she could twist to her advantage. Her holodeck buzzed, and she glanced down to see who it was. It was Glenn. Her heart dropped for a moment. Did that mean Ingrid was? Excuse me, Yuri, Edelgard said, moving to get up. But I have to step out for a moment. You can't leave now. We haven't even discussed a plan of attack yet. Sorry, Edelgard said sheepishly, holding her hands up in defeat. Just give me a few minutes. Yuri shook his head in disappointment, but nodded, gesturing for her to exit out the way she came. The door opened with a light touch. She hurriedly headed down the stairs and out of the bar, past the entrance which was being guarded by a swordsman she had never seen before. Once she was outside, she used the empty streets to her advantage since it was nearly 3 in the morning, if there even was a morning in Abyss. Before long, Edelgard found a small alley that she could set up a silencing field on filled with nothing but dumpsters and old boxes. Here, she was free to speak, and it was here she began to dial back. Come on, she muttered, holding her breath in anticipation. Please. Please pick up. For a few agonizing seconds she waited, unsure of what fate had befallen her beloved friend. Then an answer. Edelgard. Yeah, Edelgard replied, feigning sleepiness. She let the ends of her sentences hang on for longer than usual, and let some of her words slur together. It's me. Sorry, I just woke up. Is she okay? She's awake now, yeah, though she's drifting in and out of sleep, Glenn said, though his voice had a bit of hesitation to it. Can you come see her tomorrow morning? Tomorrow morning, she paused, running through the list of things she had to do as the Queen of Flames. But she remembered that Ingrid mattered more than any task at the moment, and that she would make time if necessary. After all, a rebellion could wait, her friend could not. If she could not save one person, how could she save an empire? Yes, Edelgard declared firmly. I'll come. Good. Give me a call when you're there. You seem a little distracted. Up to no good, Edelgard. She looked around at the empty streets of Abyss, and downwards at the blooded bandages peeking out from underneath her dress. Obviously Glenn was probably poking fun at her nightlife, not that she had one as an Eisner, but it still made her blink at the blatant disconnect between her words and reality. No. I'm just tired, she said, and feigned a yawn. I'll be there. Sure as the sun rises. You'd better be. Glenn out, he said, and the line cut with a click. For a moment she just leaned against the alley wall in silence, still staring at the holodeck on her wrist despite nothing showing on it. She took a moment to just take in the artificial breeze that ran through Abyss and regain a sense of who she was. Edelgard's double life was beginning to take a toll on her, and she began to realize that she was caught between the past, the present, and the future. There was her false memories, her friendships, and her fight against the God Emperor. All three could not coexist at once. She felt the more she delved into the magistrate's secrets, the less she understood about her own life. And the more promises she made, the more she realized that she could not keep most of them, if any at all. Time was ticking for the Queen of Flames and the woman underneath, and the less time she had, the more valuable each second was. Sooner or later she would have to sacrifice one of her lives, and Edelgard von Hresvelg silently wondered when that day would come. Chapter 35, Interlude, A Still Heart. Please, the voice shouted. I don't want to die. The Ashen Demon stood over the man, his whimpering form before her evoking no pity in her heart. His bedchambers were completely destroyed, as the bodyguards of his home lay dead on the floor before him. Their blood seeped into the red carpet and further deepened the rich color of the expensive furnishing, as the scent of death wafted into her sensors. She simply stood there, emotionless, as she readied her blade to do what needed to be done. Other men rushed in to stop her, but the Ashen Demon simply whirled around and cut them down as they stood. The first man's torso was completely severed, one half crumpling as his legs gave out while the top half crashed to the ground unceremoniously. The second man caught a stab to the chest, as her energy blade cut through his armor like a hot knife through butter. He gasped and spluttered as he breathed for a few stray moments, before his body betrayed him and he fell to the floor. Papa, a little girl shouted, running over to where her father was crawling on the floor. She was a young one, with brown pigtails and a pink bow on top of her head. She hugged the fabric of his suit as tightly as he could as he continued to whimper and groan. Annabelle. No. You have to hide, he pleaded. I won't. I don't want you to leave me. Please. She watched as the presumed father and daughter cried and sniffled, before she once more moved towards the two of them. Pierre von Forger. You have transgressed against the Empire for the last time. Your punishment is death. I haven't done anything, he sobbed. Please. She remained silent, watching as the girl sobbed and pulled at her father's clothing. Tears ran down the man's face, as the look of despair gave way to a grim determination on his face. Perhaps he had accepted his death already. It was far less amusing when they did not resist. Then if it must be done, he declared, kill me and be done with it. But leave my daughter alone. I'll do anything, please. His voice was fraught with desperation, the kind that she had heard all too often from the dying. She pondered the thought for a moment. The orders were to kill every single member of the Forger household, down to the last child. Their crimes had been without question and the sins of the father were clear. But did that mean that it was productive for the child to die? No, the Ashen Demon thought, it was not. She did not flinch at the prospect of killing a young girl. But it was the waste of life that she found abhorrent. It was not necessary and thus did not have to be done. Perhaps the Ashen Demon saw a reflection of her own past life in the little girl, and that was why she stayed her blade. But she managed to convince herself that it was simple pragmatism, the girl could simply be taken alive. That was all. I will honor your request, Forger. She lowered her blade so that it pointed toward the man's face, and he instinctively flinched. Your daughter will be spared. What? He said, his face turning red with surprise. You're the Ashen Demon. You would never dash. But there will be a price. She will be coming with me, the Ashen Demon declared. No, no, he screamed, and the girl began to sob openly. Surely the man had heard rumors of what the magistrate did to children, in the mysterious experiments that had claimed the lives of more than a few noble scions. After all, their bodies had never been recovered and there had been one too many disappearances to chalk up to a simple accident or a killer on the loose. But no one could openly speak of it, and loose lips was what had gotten the Forger family killed. I will give you a minute to say your goodbyes. She had her construct set a timer for a minute before letting the two of them speak to one another. Perhaps it could be considered a mercy, but whatever information she could glean from it could prove useful. The world faded around the Ashen Demon as their heartfelt conversation began to fade. Visions flitted in the back of her head, as scenes played out from worlds she both did and did not recognize. She stared off into the distance, lost in her own thoughts as she steeled herself for what needed to be done. It did need to be done. Right? The Ashen Demon could not afford to hesitate. And this time was no different. On the second of the elapsed minute, she raised her sword and stepped toward the man. The girl had since retreated to a corner of the room, shivering and crying as she watched the energy blade glimmer with a eerie light. The man simply stared upwards at the point of the blade, and closed his eyes in acceptance. He had made peace with his own death. He was ready to die. With the finesse of an executioner, she brought the blade downward into his sniveling form, pushing the blade deeper and deeper until it plunged out of his chest and left a pool of blood on the floor. He retched for a moment at the sensation, before falling face first onto the carpet as the life drained out of his body. For a moment he twitched. Then he was still, and she drew the blade out as the blood steamed off of the blade. The girl screamed, and it was a sound that would haunt the Ashen Demon for as long as she lived. Then she began to move towards the girl, as she drew something black and shiny from underneath her dress and pulled the trigger at her before. Do you need to be replaced? Thales snarled over the link, bringing her back to reality. She shook away the memories that surfaced and stared down her superior underneath her black mask. She could not afford to show weakness before him, especially if it had to do with her prior missions. The man, if he could even be called one, was as wretched and unrelenting as ever. His aged skin had contorted into a sneer, and his beady black eyes and hair did no favors to soften his expression. The Ashen Demon remained silent and unmoving in response. She had retreated to one of the magistrate's hidden bases, the closest thing she had to a home on Newfoundland, and she was acutely aware of how blissful silence could be. It was a shame that her master had to ruin it all by calling to check on her. She was quite content with being alone. And it was not as if anyone wanted to follow her back. Shamir had vanished to another safe house, with her men following closely behind. She found Shamir to be quite amusing in spite of her constant defiance of orders, and somebody who produced results in spite of it. It would be a shame if she was to disappear too early on. You turned off the fragment mid-battle. Not to mention that once again you were unable to do what was necessary to eliminate the Queen of Flames, however necessary. His temper soared as it did whenever the hand of the Empire flew into a rage, an all too common happening these days. Something about him made her skin crawl, but seeing as he had saved the demon's life, there was a certain amount of loyalty he commanded. It was mostly undeserved, however. I wished to learn more about the Queen of Flames, she said calmly. And if you have any issues with that, take it up with the God Emperor. You answer directly to me, he shouted. Not to Nemesis. Remember that. Proper deference is required when you speak of him. Damn the titles. If you do not do as you are told, then I will have to enact a proper punishment in due time. You are fond of your construct, are you not? Thales's grim expression turned into a devious smile, and beneath the mask even the Ashen Demon paled slightly. It would be a shame if he vanished. Threatening me will not help your cause, she replied icily, keeping a cool mask of composure. Internally, however, emotions threatened to bubble up to the surface. The Ashen Demon did not care for the tools given to complete their task. She, however, did whatever was left of the woman underneath, cared far too much for something artificial who wasn't even alive. This one is far too perceptive for her own good, Thales grumbled to himself. Fine. Have it your way for now. But mark my words, if you cannot do what needs to be done, there will be consequences far beyond a simple construct. Remember what I have given you. And it all can be taken away with a flick of my wrist. Very well, the Ashen Demon replied as coldly as she could. I will keep your words in mind. Is there anything else? Normally I would recall you to the Nemesis, but there are more pressing matters at hand. I will deal with the problem of the Queen of Flames later. For now, you will be guarding the laboratories in Remire. Is there a particular reason for that? Solan's experiments must continue uninterrupted. It was bad enough that the Queen stumbled upon one of our abandoned ones, and though we have many to spare, we cannot risk an incident that will draw attention. Draw attention to what? That is on a need-to-know basis, Thales declared, and you do not need to know. I would like to know what exactly I am guarding so that I can protect our most valuable assets in case of an attack. Her words were carefully thought out. She had never been talkative, but when she did speak she was careful with what she said. Words were poisonous, extraneous dialogue was unnecessary. Solan will direct you. She had more than a few words to say about the head of intelligence and his ego larger than his forehead, but she kept her tongue for the moment. Understood. Will that be all today? That will be all, the Hand of the Empire said grimly. Remember your place, demon. And should I find your capabilities wanting, I will arrange for a replacement. If you could replace me, then you would have done it long ago, she retorted. Any loyal Cretan with a sword could do what you do. Of course, I respect your skill, he said with dripping sarcasm, but skill will not save the Empire alone. Perhaps the Queen of Flames will do, once we have broken her. From our fight, she most likely cannot easily swayed, the Ashen Demon recalled. It may prove to be a task far too troublesome even for you. There was an indignance that bubbled underneath the surface. Something about Thales's words got under her skin. But she did not pay it any mind for now. Nonsense. I have broken the will of men far greater than her. She is just more rabble, rising up against their betters. You will have what you need, and in due time, I will recall you to me for a full debriefing. And perhaps a tune-up of your syntactics and neural drive. Very well. With that the communication clicked closed, and she watched as the face of her superior faded away from blue light into nothingness. Once again the Ashen Demon was alone at her makeshift desk, and leaned back in her chair to enjoy a moment of blissful silence. The core chip for the personality construct that accompanied her sat on the table. She had not given it a name yet. Its official designation was VLR-072, and she would have to come up with a less verbose designation before it was inevitably decommissioned. It was not sentient like the Ace of the past, and considering the Pharaoh Accords stretched all the way through the upper echelons of the magistrate, it had no real intelligence. There was something almost religious in the fervor that humanity rejected artificial intelligence with. The believers of the goddess considered it an affront to her divine providence. Those who were more pragmatic knew the risk of AI taking over as the dominant life form. She let it speak for her most of the time. VLR-072 was a set of protocols, ones and zeros that determined the most appropriate thing to say in a conversation based on its personality parameters. It was more or less a close replica of Thales's mannerisms, down to the animated anger that plagued her superior. Whatever he and his ilk were planning, it was being tested through the construct that lay on the table before her. But it could not learn, and it could not adapt. That was what kept it from being human, and she watched as it ran through its programming constraints to determine what information to present to her. It was like a dog. She had once taken care of one. But that was in the past. Don't think about the past. That was the mantra that the Ashen Demon had made for herself. It was not as a result of traumatic events or a terrible tragedy, but rather a cold calculus. She could not afford to be distracted by errant thoughts. And if she ever encountered remnants of her past from back when she could still be considered fully human, she would eliminate them with extreme prejudice. The future, however, was not off limits. Out of the corner of her eye she could see scenes dancing in the background, strange premonitions of possible futures that threatened to drive her insane should she become unfocused. None of them made sense. There were several recurring themes, and over the years she had become accustomed to interpreting the worlds that she caught glimpses of. Rarely did they prove useful. Sometimes she gleaned information that she would have not been privy to otherwise. A girl named Mercedes who, for some reason, was drawn to the Death Knight like a moth to a flame. Countless visions danced by with her dying at the hand of his black scythe, though one oddly had her beneath the mask. Perhaps if she set her on the right path, then she could find out for herself whether the Death Knight was more monster than man. And perhaps it was fate that they had met out of sheer coincidence in that laboratory, though she had only given the woman a warning. Confusing as her prescience was, she understood a few things about them. The first was that events and themes tended to repeat between worlds. Souls could not be changed very easily. As unscientific as that was, the core of a human's being remained unchanged despite different circumstances. The second was that the details did not matter. The Ashen Demon could not pick out more than a glimpse of a timeline, and she was also unable to tell the difference between timelines to create a cohesive narrative. Whatever information she gained came from the same events repeated over and over and over again, until she broke down beneath the mask and begged for the visions to stop. They never did. It was a curse. She could see possibilities, but never the branches that led to their fruition. The present blurred with the future, and it was that distinction that made the Ashen Demon struggle with carrying conversations for very long. It was one thing to come up with a response from what her conversation partner said, it was another entirely to avoid speaking based on what they might say. She had told no one about it except for Father. Father understood. He always did. Father. I just hope you won't have to see me like this. She was just another hopeless soul, adrift on the currents of time. As the Ashen Demon, she had control over her blade like no other, but in the confines of her own mind, she was as vulnerable as a child. Only a rigorous schedule of mental training and meditation kept her from losing her sanity. If she lost herself to her visions, she would be nothing more than a madman, and the line between a madman and a prophet was quite thin indeed. Well, that was enough lounging around, the Ashen Demon thought to herself. She should have begun maintenance of her systems a few hours ago. Her fight with the Queen of Flames had distracted her from doing so. She walked around the darkened hallways, searching for the room that contained her hypobaric chamber. She found it in a matter of seconds, pressing her palm to the door and letting it open with a hiss of air. This was her home away from home, as the door gave way to a strange amount of machinery and wires coming out from the central capsule. A carefully calibrated system of coolant loops and robotic arms laid at the waiting for the Ashen Demon, in order to maintain her cybernetics and support her life functions. She waited as the system ran a diagnosis on its core components, before a ring of green gave her the go-ahead to move forward. She approached the piece of metal molded to her body shape that would serve as both an operating table and her coffin. The Ashen Demon quickly took off most of the armor pieces strapped onto her body along with the turquoise fabric that she used as a hood. She left it on a table beside the chamber and walked upwards toward the rat's nest of wires and servos hooked up to the machine. Turning around so that she faced the door, she let the temporary restraints engage as she stretched her arms out. Within a second her arms and legs were fixed tightly, and now came the dangerous process of removing her cybernetics. The Ashen Demon did not feel pain except for when her mechanical parts were being replaced. She was more machine than human now. The price she had paid for life was that her body was made out of a titanium composite rather than flesh and blood. Only a few of her delicate internal organs remained human, as her muscles in her limbs and torso had long been replaced with cybernetic components. Even her eyes were mechanical in nature, a convenient artificial replacement that felt just like the real thing. First the mask was removed, a delicate process, seeing as it was the only thing that protected her still human face. The arms carefully removed the metal piece by piece, making sure that the biomechanical interface remained intact underneath. The Ashen Demon could see her own guise reflected before her in a display, and it was a face that she did not recognize. Her once wide-eyed gaze was reduced to a cold and solemn stare, and the flesh around her eyes continued to deteriorate as if she had aged 20 years in less than 10. Surgically implanted interface lines ran up and down her cheeks, which had lost their fullness in the years since her mechanization. And her skin was pale and ashen, a far cry from the luster it once had. The Ashen Demon was a shadow of herself, the cost of power. She screamed internally as the artificial biot issue that constituted as skin was peeled off to reveal the metal plates and reinforced wires that made up most of her lower half. Actuators on the wall behind her began to drive into her skin until she lost the feeling of touch entirely. The arms gently pricked and prodded at various components, engaging several of the mechanical muscles to verify their integrity. She, of course, could see the entire thing from the screen projected a few feet from her eyes. perhaps before she would have looked away. But as the Ashen Demon, she now watched layer by layer as her humanity was stripped away. A few red marks denoted that there had been failures in the right deltoid and in several of her ulnar muscles. These were servos and actuators meant to replicate the function of various muscle groups, and they often failed quite regularly. But seeing as there were tens of thousands of them to act as a failsafe, it was rare to have an actual failure in combat. She numbly watched as the machine cut away at the affected pieces only to carefully replace it with a brand new set of actuators. Once the diagnosis was complete and the affected systems were judged ready for deployment, the arms reeled back and the restraints on her body came off. A cool rush of air flushed in, and though she had long lost feeling below her neck as a result of her artificial skin being stripped off, it was a relieving feeling. There would be no more pain for now. She could rest. She had to admit that she felt better with most of the extraneous parts of her mechanical body stripped off. There was something so intensely wrong about having the sensation of skin, yet feeling the cold of steel and metal upon her fingertips. The Ashen Demon felt suffocated in her steel carcass of a body, a discomfort that she had learned to bear. The scientists had said that it would go away with time. A lie. There were many lies that the magistrate had told her. But it was not as if she could do anything about it without disrupting her ambitions. The Ashen Demon was free to move around as she pleased here, free of most of the problems that plagued her cybernetic body. A full body replacement was imperfect, and though most of her head aside from her eyes remained human, it still had its own set of problems that required a team working full-time to assess. She had once learned the names of the people that serviced her, only for them to be replaced when they messed up. After the third set of scientists, she stopped asking entirely. Better not to know than to know and to lose them anyway. She peeled her body off of the wall and began to pace around. Now the visions began to return, echoes of possible futures that danced around in the corner of her eyes. Though many scenes flitted around in the darkness, a flash of blue caught her eye. She watched as a blond man in a royal blue cape hunched over in the darkness, holding a metallic spear stained with blood. Covering his eye was a makeshift patch made out of a piece of fabric, most likely ripped from the tattered black shreds that covered his bloody armor. She watched as a hand reached out from her perspective, gently reaching out toward him to offer assistance. There was a pause, and for a moment his lips moved. Then there was a rustling underneath his cape as the man began to rise to his full height, pushing off the stone floor with the handle of his spear. The hand remained outstretched and ignored. There was an overwhelming feeling of sadness in her heart as she watched the scene fade before her eyes. The Ashen Demon did not feel emotion. But for some reason her visions evoked a feeling of melancholy and despair that made the demon slink away in disgust. Sometimes the woman she had once been would surface once more, and she both hated and yearned for those feelings to truly take hold of her heart in something more than a vision. The ones that were most concerning were the ones that had no basis in reality at all, and this seemed to be one of them. She caught glimpses of a dragon raising the world beneath them to ash, dark magic enveloping a castle in a purple void, along with a dogfight between two sleek aircraft in the skies of a world she did not recognize. A lesser woman would have been driven mad by what she saw. But she was not human anymore. She was the Ashen Demon. One person in her prophetic flashes tugged at her heart like no other. She was a girl with pale white hair, the color of snow and just as fragile to boot. She wore a haughty expression on the exterior, but underneath there was a rare smile that sometimes appeared in her visions. For reasons she could not quite understand, it made her mechanical heart beat more than usual. It was a figure of speech. Of course the continuous pump in her body that pushed blood through her veins did not beat. But she had a heartbeat once, and she imagined that the feeling of seeing the girl smile was pretty much the same. The girl had appeared once in her own reality, before the bloodied and broken body of the Death Knight. The Ashen Demon had been preoccupied with restraining the murderous creature and prepping him for transport, but she could have sworn that there was a spark in her eyes that lingered when they made eye contact. But she feared that if she pressed for details, the girl would flee and she would lose any lead on who she was for eternity. She hoped to see her once more, either in her dreams or in reality. But the visions continued on without any sight of the white-haired girl, and so the Ashen Demon sighed in disappointment. Hope was a dangerous thing in Newfoundland. It prompted humans to act irrationally, without any regard for their well-being. It was a mercy to crush their hope so that they would pass on to the afterlife without any delusions to cloud their judgment. She had done that more than once, and memories of slit throats and cries for mercy flooded back to the surface. Perhaps that was why the Queen of Flames continued in her folly. She had hope, and that was a thing that could not be tolerated. Perhaps it was hope that also stymied the Ashen Demon's blade, a mistake that she would correct sooner or later. The visions that she had seen only served to confirm her conviction. The Queen would not be there to bear witness to the future of New Fodlan. That, she could be 98.7% sure about. Enough, the Ashen Demon thought. I cannot rely on these visions forever. I must do what needs to be done. And with the firm conviction of an automaton, she began to go through the various reports that Thales had provided for her. Normally the Hand liked to micromanage every aspect of his subordinates and their lives, but he gave the Ashen Demon a surprising amount of leeway when it came to how she performed her duties. Perhaps he had gotten soft, but perhaps it was that he could not stand the presence of the demon. She was, after all, perhaps the one being in existence that could put him down for good. As a result, most of their communications were through the trade of information. The first one was a report on her combat simulations. A simulated battle against the entire 8th Legion, and the Ashen Demon put her at 99% odds of victory, and she put that to the test when she cleanly cut her way through them in the testing chamber. It was not as if they were lacking in skill or discipline, they simply were far too human to land so much as a scratch on her. The 1% chance came from an unexpected development, or a failure in her systems that proved enough of a handicap for the soldiers to swarm her. It was unnecessary to kill them all. She only had to destroy the chain of command, and with the leadership gone, the soldiers were all but useless. The report noted that significant changes would have to be made in order to account for the eradication of officers in combat, and recommended several fail-safes to the Legion's hierarchy of orders. And so it was that even though she had only cut through less than 1% of the 8th Legion, she had ended up reducing its true battle strength to around 5%. She supposed that she made a poor substitute for a simulation of the Queen of Flames against an Imperial Legion. After all, sending the Ashen Demon was overkill in the majority of circumstances, and the leader of the rebellion lacked both her skill and her strength. The second was a report on all of the active laboratories in New Fodlan serving Cornelia and Solon. One of them stood to mind the research facility underneath Mount Gaspard. They had lost contact with the scientists working there several weeks before the invasion began, and most of the entrances had collapsed. Thales had considered sending the Ashen Demon to investigate and put down whoever remained, but she judged it a waste of her time. It was worthless, they could not leave, and whatever information anyone gleaned from the data contained there was useless in the hands of the uninformed. And it was not her job to clean up all of the magistrate's messes. She had reminded Thales of that in one of their previous meetings. It bothered her that even she did not know what they were doing. The Ashen Demon had never been particularly interested in the specifics, but without a careful understanding of genetic manipulation and Arnhem cell theory it was impossible to parse any of the reports. Thales and his ilk had been notoriously tight-lipped about what was going on, and she wondered if they were doing it behind the God Emperor's back. He would not be happy to find that out. But it was also not the Ashen Demon's job to spy on her superior for his superior, so she let the matter sit for now. The third was a case file on one Hubert Gaspard. She had seen the boy in more than one of her visions, though it was impossible to discern anything from them. From what she understood, he represented the House of Gaspard as Lonato's adopted heir. And seeing as Lonato Gaspard was currently indisposed, Ash held a surprising amount of power in his hands. It was in the best interest of the magistrate to take him out as soon as possible. Unfortunately, the God Emperor wanted him alive. Shamir had failed. She rarely ever failed, and even when she did, the assassin always circled back later and finished the job. But she supposed that the former mercenary had not been expecting the Queen of Flames in Abyss, and so came woefully underprepared. It was fortunate that the Ashen Demon had been investigating a spate of disappearances in the Abyss at the time, and thus had the opportunity to come to the rescue. Oh, she knew that she could have cut all of them down without hesitation. But they represented minuscule threats in the grand scheme of things, and they could easily be leveraged in the future as pawns. It would not do to kill them too early. Instead, all the Ashen Demon had to do was let the crops grow before she harvested the fruit of her labor. And of course there was the issue of the feelings that the Queen of Flames somehow evoked, a faint sense of nostalgia, a clinging to memories that had long since vanished. She supposed that letting her live was a better play in the long run. Ash, however, was unnecessary and thus could be removed. Another variable to be eliminated. But why was she so hesitant in doing it herself? Only time would give her the answers, as ironic as that was considering that time meant nothing to a woman who could see beyond the fabric of linearity. She would investigate the Queen of Flames, and judge her worthy or not of being assimilated into the fold. And if they resisted, she would die. Simple. But the feelings that tugged at her iron heart were threatening to devour her, and the Ashen Demon was beginning to unravel little by little. She did not know how long she could do this for, and though her body would not give, her mind would. But for the future of New Fodlan, her mind was a small price to pay for the salvation of humanity. She would cut her own path and find a future that succeeded. And she would find the white-haired girl in order to finally put an end to the emotions that plagued her soul, and so that she could sever her last links to humanity and become the Ashen Demon that she herself feared becoming. Check the description for the links to the author.